Tonight, we're uncovering the hidden truth about Gwayne Hightower. There is plenty to unpack tonight, but I'll keep the narration slow and steady so you can still ease into sleep. Thank you to those of you who've been joining us consistently. If you're falling asleep with us tonight, let me know in the comments how many nights in a row you've been here. And if this is your first night, just comment night 1. Now back to the video. At the Heirs tournament, Sir Gwayne Hightower rode as one of Queen Alicent's champions, dressed in the confidence of a young nobleman, certain of his place in the world. Then Sir Criston unhorsed him. It was a brief defeat amid the pageantry of King Viserys's court, but it left behind a curious tension. Gwayne had fallen before the very man who would later become one of the most powerful figures in his sister's cause. Gwayne was born into one of the oldest houses in Westeros. House Hightower ruled from Oldtown, beneath the immense stone tower that gave the family its name. Their city sheltered the citadel, where maesters studied the mysteries of the world, and the starry sept, once the heart of the faith of the Seven. The Hightowers did not need dragons to command influence. Their wealth, learning, faith, and long memory had made them powerful for centuries. He was the youngest son of Son of Otto Hightower, the calculating hand of the king, and the younger brother of Alicent Hightower, who became Queen of the Seven Kingdoms when she married Viserys I. For Gwayne, family was never simply family. It was courtly position, political duty, and a name that carried expectations wherever he went. In the histories, he came to King's Landing as a child, when Otto was chosen to serve King Jaehaerys. The Hightower children arrived at court with their mother, entering a world where every smile might conceal an alliance, and every celebration might alter the future of the realm. Gwayne grew up near the center of royal power, though he was never the center of it himself. That distinction may explain something about his character. He often appears proud, sharp-tongued, and comfortable judging those around him. Yet pride was useful at court. It was armor of a different kind. A Hightower son could not be weak, and he could not be invisible. He had to represent his house, his father, and eventually, his queenly sister. The television version gives this idea a slightly different shape. There, Gwayne has spent many years away in Oldtown, separated from Alicent and the court where her children were raised. When he finally rides to King's Landing, he is not merely returning to his family. He is entering a conflict that has been growing without him, where old loyalties have hardened into armies. His arrival also places him near Criston once again. The young knight who humbled him in the tournament has become a hardened commander, a man shaped by grief, ambition, and war. Gwayne's manner can seem frivolous beside Criston's severity, but the contrast is important. One carries the polished confidence of Oldtown, the other carries the cold discipline of a man who has made himself indispensable. Still, Gwayne is not only a decorated noble sent to stand near the action. Beneath his arrogance is a real attachment to House Hightower. He serves the Greens because Alicent is his sister, Otto is his father, and their cause has become inseparable from the fate of his family. In a war of dragons and crowns, that kind of loyalty can be as dangerous as any sword. And as the war reveals the uglier habits of soldiers, Gwayne begins to show that he has not forgotten what knighthood is supposed to mean. His sense of honor may be imperfect, even naive at times, but it is sincere. He understands that a knight's vows are not meant to be ornaments worn in peacetime. They are meant to matter when obedience becomes easy and mercy becomes difficult. That is the quieter truth of Gwayne Hightower. He is neither the grand architect of the war, nor one of its dragon-riding legends. He is something more human, a privileged son of a great house, caught between vanity, duty, family, and the slow realization that honor asks more of him than looking noble beneath a Hightower banner. To understand Gwayne Hightower, you have to look past the dragons, past the crowns, the thrones, the great hands of the king who shaped policy from the shadows. The histories of the dance are crowded with figures who commanded armies or rode beasts of legend. Gwayne commanded neither. He was a knight, yes, but a knight who never sat the Iron Throne, never whispered a treaty into a king's ear, never mounted a dragon. He existed in the margins of the story, a name that appears in lists of champions and casualty reports. And yet, his life tells us something about the war that the grand narratives often miss. It tells us about the private fractures of House Hightower, the cracks that ran through a family that seemed, from the outside, unbreakable. The Hightowers of Oldtown were not like the other great houses. They did not need to shout their power. Their power was written in stone, in the great tower that rose above the city, in the citadel, where maesters studied the movements of stars and the properties of raven's blood, in the starry sept, where the faith had once seated its highest authority. The Hightowers were old when the Targaryens first landed. They had seen empires rise and fall. They knew that influence, true influence, did not require a crown. It required patience, wealth, and the ability to wait. Otto Hightower understood this. He served as Hand of the King under Jaehaerys I, then under Viserys I, and he played the long game with a master's precision. He placed his daughter Alicent on the throne. He positioned his family at the center of power, but he also had sons. And sons, in a house like this, were not simply children. They were instruments. They were extensions of the family's will. Gwayne was the youngest of those sons, and that position shaped everything about him. To be the youngest son in a house like Hightower was to live in a particular kind of shadow. Your older brothers inherited the titles, the lands, the responsibilities. You inherited expectations. You were expected to serve, to represent, to be a knight of good standing who could be deployed where needed. You were not expected to be the architect of the family's fortunes. You were expected to be a brick in the wall. Gwayne grew up in King's Landing after his father was named Hand, arriving in 101 AC with his mother and siblings. He learned the rhythms of court life early. He learned that a smile could be a weapon, that a well-timed word could shift a conversation, that appearances mattered more than truth. And he learned that he was not the most important person in the room. That was his father, that was his sister, the queen, that was the king. Gwayne was a supporting character in a story that did not belong to him. This is the tension that defines him. He was proud, sharp-tongued, quick to judge. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who knew his house's name could open any door. But that confidence was also armor. It protected him from the awareness that he was, in many ways, expendable. A Hightower son could be sent to a tournament to represent the Queen. A Hightower son could be sent to war. A Hightower son could be sent to his death, and the house would continue, because the house was eternal. The individual was not. Gwayne understood this, perhaps not consciously, but in the way he carried himself, in the way he bristled at slights, in the way he sought recognition. He wanted to matter. He wanted his name to mean something beyond his family's legacy. And then there was the tournament. The Heirs Tournament, in 111 AC, celebrating the 5th anniversary of Viserys and Alicent's marriage. Gwayne rode as one of Alicent's champions, dressed in the colors of his house, confident in his skill. He was unhorsed by Sir Criston Cole. It was a brief moment, a fall that barely registered in the grand sweep of the event. But it left a residue. Criston Cole, the son of a steward, the man who had risen from nothing, had bested the son of the Hand of the King. And years later, when the war came, Criston Cole would become the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, the most powerful military figure in the Green faction. Gwayne would serve under him. That fall in the tournament was a premonition of a hierarchy that had not yet fully formed. The show gives this relationship a different texture. In the television adaptation, Gwayne has spent decades in Oldtown, separated from his sister and the court. He arrives in King's Landing in the 2nd season, riding for 3 months, sent by the Hightowers to monitor Criston Cole and to ensure that House Hightower's interests are protected. He steps into a war that has already been shaped by others. He is not a strategist. He is not a dragon rider. He is a knight, and he is expected to fight. But he is also expected to represent his house, to be a check on Criston's growing power, to remind everyone that the Hightowers are still watching. This is the private fracture. The Hightowers do not trust even their own commanders. They send a son to keep an eye on the man who leads their armies. That is the reality of power in a civil war. Loyalty is never certain. Family is never enough. Gwayne's arrogance, his flamboyance, his sharp tongue, these are not simply flaws. They are defenses. He walks into a room where everyone has already decided who he is. He is Otto's son. He is Alicent's brother. He is a Hightower. He is not himself. And so he pushes back, asserting his presence in ways that can seem petty or proud. But beneath that surface, there is something else. There is a man who believes in the idea of knighthood, not the politics of it, not the convenience of it, but the ideal. The oath, the promise that a knight protects the weak, that a knight does not become a beast, that a knight remembers what he is supposed to be. This becomes clear in the third season, when Gwayne confronts Criston Cole about the army's treatment of village women. The soldiers have been taking what they want, treating the women of the countryside as spoils of war. Criston dismisses it as the reality of conflict, the ugliness that comes when men are far from home and discipline loosens. But Gwayne does not accept this. He argues that knights are not beasts. He argues that their oaths mean something. He argues that if they forget what they are supposed to protect, then they are no better than the criminals they were sworn to oppose. It is a moment of moral clarity, and it comes from a man who has been dismissed as arrogant and naive. It reveals that Gwayne has been paying attention. He has been watching the war, watching what it does to people, and he has decided that he will not become part of the ugliness. This is the central tension of his character. He is a Hightower, born into privilege, raised to expect deference, shaped by a family that values power above all else. And yet he searches for honor in a war that has none. He tries to hold on to something that the conflict is systematically destroying. He is not perfect. He is not a saint. He is proud, and he is sometimes foolish, and he does not always see the consequences of his own actions. But he is trying. And in a war where so many have stopped trying, where so many have surrendered to cruelty or ambition, that effort matters. The private fractures of House Hightower are not just about politics. They are about the gap between what the family expects and what the individual can bear. Gwayne was raised to be a loyal son, a dutiful brother, a knight who served the green cause without question. But the war asks him to question everything. It asks him to watch his fellow knights become predators. It asks him to serve under a man who once humiliated him in a tournament, and who now commands armies with cold efficiency. It asks him to be a Hightower first, and a human being second, and he resists, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the small decisions he makes, in the moments when he chooses to speak, in the moments when he chooses to act. He is not the hero of this story. He is not the villain. He is something quieter. He is a knight at the edge of history, standing where the great events have already passed him by, trying to find a way to be good in a world that has stopped caring about goodness. And that, perhaps, is the most human thing about him. To understand Gwayne Hightower, you must first understand the city that shaped him. Not King's Landing, where he would later serve, but Oldtown, the ancient city of maesters, septons, merchants, and noble ambition, a place where knowledge and power have flowed together for millennia, like the honey wine into the sunset sea. Oldtown is not merely the oldest city in Westeros. It is the memory of the continent itself. Before the Targaryens came, before the Andals crossed the narrow sea, even before the first men carved their runes into the weirwoods, the foundations of this city were laid, and at its heart, rising from a small island in the river's mouth, stands the High Tower. A great white tower that is not just a fortress or a seat of rule, but a beacon, a flame that has burned atop its pinnacle since the dawn of days, guiding ships, and, in a way, guiding the destiny of the realm. House Hightower is one of the oldest powers in Westeros. They did not conquer their way to prominence with dragonfire or overwhelming legions. They built it. They traded. They learned. They married wisely, and they waited. While other houses rose and fell with the seasons, the Hightowers remained, their influence reaching far beyond their banners. They are the custodians of the Citadel, where the maesters forge their chains and hoard the world's knowledge. They are the protectors of the Starry Sept, the spiritual heart of the Faith of the Seven, before the Great Sept was built in King's Landing. To be born a Hightower is to be born into a legacy of quiet, enduring authority. And that is the world Gwayne Hightower entered. Born in the shadow of that great white tower, the youngest son of Sir Otto Hightower. He did not grow up in the clamour and chaos of the Red Keep, not at first. He grew up here, in the cool, salt-tinged air of Oldtown. He would have walked the cobbled streets past the Citadel's great gates, heard the bells of the Starry Sept ring across the river, and watched the beacon fire cast its long shadow over the city each night. This was his home, a city of scholars and priests, of merchants and lords, all living beneath the watchful eye of his family's tower. It is a strange thing, to be born into a family whose influence is so vast, yet so subtle. The Hightowers do not need to shout their power. It is felt. It is in the books that leave the Citadel, in the prayers offered at the Sept, in the gold that flows through their counting houses. Gwayne was raised in this understanding. He was taught that his name carried weight, not because of swords, but because of centuries of careful stewardship. He was a son of Oldtown, and that meant something. But this quiet life, this immersion in the ancient rhythms of the city, would not last. In the year 101 after Aegon's conquest, his father, Otto Hightower, was named Hand of the King by the old king, Jaehaerys I. The family was summoned to King's Landing. Gwayne, still a boy, left the White Tower behind and travelled to the Red Keep, to a court that was louder, brighter, and far more dangerous than the one he had known. He left the city of maesters and septons and entered the city of kings and queens. Yet, in many ways, he never truly left Oldtown behind. The show would later depict him as having lived there for decades, separated from his family after they moved south. And even in the books, where he remained in the capital, the influence of his upbringing is clear. He carried the Hightowers' sense of order, their pride, their deep-seated belief in the proper way of things. He was a knight of the Reach, trained in its chivalric traditions, and he expected the world to conform to those ideals. This is the foundation of his character. An arrogance, yes, but one born from a genuine belief in the structure of his world. He was not a schemer, like his father, nor a politician like his sister the Queen. He was a knight, a son of Oldtown, who believed that honor and duty were as solid as the stone of the High Tower itself. This belief would be tested, again and again, as the realm fractured and the dance of the dragons began. He would find that the world does not always bend to the ideals of a city built on ancient stone and older wisdom. And that is where his story, the story of a man caught between the quiet power of his home and the brutal reality of war, truly begins. From the ancient White Tower of Oldtown, we now turn our gaze toward the man who would carry its ambitions to the Iron Throne itself. Sir Otto Hightower was not born to rule, but he was born to shape those who did. He was the second son of Lord Hightower, a man of sharp intellect and sharper patience, who learned early that in the Game of Thrones, the most powerful weapon is not a sword, but a well-placed word. When King Jaehaerys I called him to court in 101 years after Aegon's conquest, Otto did not hesitate. He left behind the cool stone halls of the High Tower, the salt air of the Whispering Sound, and brought with him a family bound by duty and expectation. Otto's rise was methodical. He became Hand of the King not through battlefield glory, but through years of quiet service, of reading the currents of court politics, with the same precision a maester reads the stars. He was a man who understood that power flows from information, from knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. And in King's Landing, he found a king who valued such counsel. Jaehaerys was old, his reign long and storied, and he needed a hand who could manage the machinery of the realm without seeking personal glory. Otto Hightower was that man. He was calculating, yes, but not cruel. Ambitious, but not reckless. He served the realm as he served his house, with an unwavering belief that order and stability were the highest virtues. But Otto was also a father, and in the world of Westeros, a father's legacy is measured not only in his own deeds, but in the children he raises. For Otto, this meant instilling in his sons and daughters a single, unyielding principle: obedience to the family, refinement in all things, and usefulness to the cause. His children were not raised to be happy, they were raised to be effective. Every lesson, every expectation, every quiet word of correction was aimed at shaping them into instruments of House Hightower's enduring influence. The eldest son would inherit the seat of Oldtown, the weight of the Hightower name. The daughters would be married to strengthen alliances, their beauty and grace traded like currency in the great halls of power. And the younger sons, like Gwayne, would serve as knights, as commanders, as the sword arm of the family's will. Gwayne Hightower was born into this world of careful calculation. He was close enough to power to feel its pull, to taste the honey of courtly life, but he was never destined to inherit it. That distinction belonged to his elder brother, the heir to Oldtown. Gwayne was a younger son, and in the hierarchy of noble families, that meant he would have to earn his place through service, through loyalty, through the strength of his arm and the sharpness of his blade. He grew up in the shadow of the Hightower, that great pale finger pointing toward the sky, and he learned early that his worth would be measured not by his birth but by his deeds. When Otto brought his family to King's Landing, Gwayne was just a boy. He watched his father navigate the treacherous waters of the Red Keep, saw how a well-timed silence could be more powerful than a shouted command. He learned to read the faces of lords and ladies, to recognize the subtle shifts in allegiance that could mean life or death. And he learned that his father's expectations were not cruel, but they were absolute. Otto did not demand love from his children. He demanded excellence. He demanded that they be useful. For Gwayne, this meant becoming a knight. He trained in the yards of the Red Keep, sparring with the sons of other great houses, learning the art of war from seasoned veterans. He was skilled, certainly, but he was also arrogant. He had the confidence of a young man who had never truly been tested, who believed that his name and his father's position would carry him through any challenge. That arrogance would be tested, publicly and humiliatingly, in the tourney of 111 years after the conquest, when he served as one of Queen Alicent's champions. It was there that Sir Criston Cole, the Queen's own sworn protector, unhorsed him with a single, devastating charge. The crowd gasped. Gwayne's pride took a wound that would take years to heal. But that is a story for a moment yet to come. For now, let us linger on the man who shaped him. Otto Hightower was not a man of grand gestures or fiery speeches. He was a man of patience, of long games, of waiting for the right moment to strike. He saw in his son Gwayne a raw material that could be honed, a blade that needed tempering, and he knew that the boy's arrogance, while a flaw, could also be a strength if directed properly. A knight who believed in his own invincibility was a knight who would charge into battle without hesitation. The trick was to ensure he charged in the right direction, and so Gwayne grew, caught between the expectations of his father and the reality of his own limitations. He was not the heir. He was not the brilliant strategist his father was. He was a knight, a soldier, a man of action rather than words. But in the world Otto Hightower had built, even a simple knight could be useful. The question was whether Gwayne would learn to temper his pride with wisdom, whether he would become the weapon his father intended or shatter against the hard truths of war. As the years passed, the seeds of conflict were sown. King Viserys I's reign grew troubled, and the question of succession cast a long shadow over the realm. Otto Hightower, ever the calculating statesman, saw the storm coming. He positioned his family, his daughter Alicent, now queen, his son Gwayne, a knight of the court, all pieces on a board that would soon be swept by fire and blood. And in that coming storm, every son of House Hightower would be called to serve. The weight of that service, the expectations placed upon a younger son, the burden of being useful without ever being the master of your own fate. These are the forces that would shape Gwayne Hightower into the man he would become. And as we move forward, we will see how that shaping played out in the fields of tourney and the blood-soaked fields of war, how a boy who learned to obey became a man who learned to question. But first, we must understand the world he was born into, the world of a father who saw his children not as individuals, but as instruments of a greater purpose. That is the world of Otto Hightower, and it is the world that made Gwayne Hightower what he was. Otto Hightower had always understood that his children were instruments of the family's ambition, but even he could not have predicted which of them would rise highest. By the time he returned to King's Landing, as Hand of the King under Viserys I, his eldest daughter Alicent had already begun her long walk toward the Iron Throne. But the Hightower line did not end with Alicent. There were other children, younger sons and daughters, who remain nameless in the histories, and among them stood the youngest brother, Gwayne Hightower. To understand Gwayne, you must first understand the peculiar weight of being the youngest son in a house that had already produced a queen. Alicent's path was one of courtly grace and political marriage, a trajectory that carried her from the Red Keep's gardens to the very seat of power in Westeros. She learned to speak softly while wielding influence like a blade, to smile at enemies while arranging their falls. But Gwayne's path ran parallel to hers, never intersecting. Where Alicent mastered the art of the whispered word, Gwayne trained for the clash of steel. Where she navigated the treacherous currents of court intrigue, he learned to ride and fight and command. They were siblings, yes, but their lives had already diverged before either of them fully understood what they were becoming. Gwayne was born in Oldtown, likely sometime before 96 AC, the youngest of Alicent's brothers. The historical records do not give us the names of all Otto Hightower's children, only that there were several. Some were daughters married off to lords of the Reach, their names lost to the centuries. Others were sons who died young, or chose the life of a maester or septon. But Gwayne survived, and he survived into an age when his sister's name was spoken in every hall from the Wall to Sunspear. When Otto was named Hand of the King by old King Jaehaerys I in 101 AC, the entire Hightower household relocated to King's Landing. Gwayne would have been a boy then, perhaps 5 or 6 years old enough to remember the journey from Oldtown's ancient streets to the bustling chaos of the capital. He grew up in the shadow of the Red Keep, watching his father govern the realm, watching his sister ascend to queenhood, watching his family's fortunes rise like the tide. But he was not destined for the throne room. He was destined for the training yard. The contrast between Alicent and Gwayne is most visible in the choices they made, or rather, the choices that were made for them. Alicent was married to a king, old enough to be her father, a man whose health was already failing when she bore his children. She became queen at an age when most girls are still learning to dance. Gwayne, by contrast, was given the freedom of the sword. He could ride to tourneys, drink with knights, and dream of glory. His sister's fate was sealed by a crown. His was sealed by a sword belt. And yet, for all his freedom, Gwayne lived in the shadow of his sister's extraordinary fate. Every lord who met him measured him against Alicent. Every conversation at court began with the Queen's health, the Queen's children, the Queen's influence. Gwayne was the Queen's brother, nothing more and nothing less. He could win 100 tourneys and still be introduced as Alicent Hightower's youngest brother. It was a burden he carried with varying degrees of grace. Sometimes with the arrogance of a man who knows his name opens doors. Sometimes with the quiet resentment of a man who knows his name will never be his own. In 111 AC, the 5th anniversary of Viserys and Alicent's marriage was celebrated with a grand tourney. Gwayne participated, serving as one of his sister's champions. It was a moment of public honour, a chance to prove himself before the realm, but the tourney did not go as planned. Gwayne was unhorsed by a relatively unknown knight of the Dornish Marches, a man named Criston Cole. That moment, that single fall from a horse, would echo through the rest of Gwayne's life. Criston Cole went on to become the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, the Queen's protector, and eventually the military commander of the Green faction. Gwayne, meanwhile, remained a knight of House Hightower, competent but never legendary. In the television adaptation of this history, Gwayne is portrayed as having lived in Oldtown for decades after his family moved to King's Landing. He arrives in the capital only in the 2nd season, riding for 3 months to answer his family's call. This version of Gwayne is arrogant, flamboyant and naive, but also deeply loyal. He comes to King's Landing not for glory but for duty, sent by the Hightowers to monitor Criston Cole and to ensure that House Hightower's interests are protected in the coming war. It is a role that suits him, or at least it suits the man he is trying to become. The younger Hightower children, the ones whose names we do not know, grew up in the same shadow. They were taught obedience, refinement, and usefulness. They were trained to serve the family's ambitions, to marry well, to die quietly if necessary. But Gwayne was different. He was the youngest brother, the one who might have been overlooked entirely if not for his sister's rise. And so he carved out a place for himself, not in the history books, but in the training yards and battlefields of the Dance of the Dragons. As the war between the Greens and the Blacks began to take shape, Gwayne found himself drawn into the conflict. In the books, he served as an officer of the City Watch, the Gold Cloaks of King's Landing. His father Otto named him second in command, instructing him to watch for disloyalty among the watchmen. It was a position of trust, but also of danger. The City Watch was a volatile force, and its commander, Luther Largent, had ties to Prince Daemon Targaryen. Gwayne was caught between his father's orders and the shifting loyalties of the men he commanded. When Queen Rhaenyra's forces finally attacked King's Landing in 130 AC, Gwayne rushed to the stables to sound the alarm. He was seized, disarmed, and dragged before Luther Largent, who had remained loyal to Daemon. Gwayne was captured, and in the chaos of the sack he died. His death was not heroic in the traditional sense. There was no last stand, no dramatic duel. He was simply a man in the wrong place at the wrong time, a casualty of a war that had already consumed so many. But in the show, his story continues. He confronts Criston Cole about the treatment of village women, arguing that knights are not beasts and that their oaths of chastity mean something. Is a moment of moral growth, a shift from arrogance to empathy. Gwayne begins to understand that honour is not just about winning tourneys or serving your family. It is about choosing to be better than the world expects you to be. The younger Hightower children, the ones we never see, the ones whose names are lost to time, they grew up in the shadow of Alicent's crown and Gwayne's sword. They were taught to be useful, to be quiet, to be forgotten, and they were. But Gwayne at least left a mark. He was arrogant, yes, and sometimes naive, but he was also loyal, and in the end he tried to be honourable. That is more than many men can say. And so the story of Gwayne Hightower is not just the story of a youngest brother. It is the story of a family that reached too high and paid too dearly. It is the story of a queen who sacrificed her childhood for a throne, and a knight who sacrificed his life for a cause he barely understood. It is the story of the Hightowers, a house that built its power on knowledge and faith, and watched it all burn in the fire of dragons. The year 101 after the conquest marks a quiet but decisive turning point for House Hightower. King Jaehaerys I, the Old King, had ruled for over half a century, and his reign was entering its long twilight. The question of succession hung over the Red Keep like a storm cloud that refused to break. In that year, the king summoned Sir Otto Hightower from Oldtown to serve as his hand. It was a position of immense trust and influence, one that would bind the Hightowers to the Iron Throne for generations to come. Otto did not travel alone. He brought his household with him, including his wife and their children. Among them was his youngest son, a boy named Gwayne. For Gwayne, this was not simply a move to a new city. It was an entry into a world where every smile carried a purpose, every whispered word was a piece on a board, and every courtesy concealed a calculation. King's Landing was not Oldtown. Oldtown was ancient, yes, but it was a city of scholars and septons, of quiet libraries and the slow turning of the tide. King's Landing was a city of ambition, of steel and fire, of men who rose and fell in the span of a single court session. The Red Keep itself was a labyrinth of stone and shadow, its halls lined with tapestries depicting the conquests of Aegon, the dragon, and his sisters. For a boy like Gwayne, it must have been overwhelming. The air was thick with the scent of salt from the black water, the distant roar of the dragon pit, and the constant murmur of courtiers moving from chamber to chamber. Every door was guarded, every corridor watched. In Oldtown, the Hightower stood as a beacon of stability, a white tower that had watched over the city for thousands of years. In King's Landing, the Hightowers were newcomers, and they had to prove their worth. Otto understood this better than anyone. He had been raised in the shadow of the citadel, trained in the art of diplomacy and the careful management of information. He knew that power in the Red Keep was not won through strength of arms alone, but through patience, through alliances, through the subtle manipulation of perception. He brought his family to this court to plant a seed, to ensure that the Hightower name would be spoken with respect long after he was gone. For young Gwayne, the transition was not easy. He was the youngest son, the one who would never inherit the Hightower seat, the one who would have to carve his own path. In Oldtown, he had been a child of privilege, surrounded by the comforts of a great house. In King's Landing, he was just another face in a sea of ambitious nobles. He had to learn the language of the court, the unspoken rules that governed who rose and who fell. He had to learn that a compliment could be a weapon, that a gift could be a debt, and that loyalty was a currency that could be spent only once. The Red Keep became his classroom. He watched his father navigate the treacherous currents of the court. Though Otto spoke to the king with deference and to the lords with measured authority, he saw how the small council operated, how decisions were made in hushed tones behind closed doors. He saw the dragons too, great beasts that were both symbols of power and living weapons. The Targaryens were not like other men. They rode fire and blood, and they expected the world to bow. Gwayne's own path was not yet clear. He was too young to be a knight, too old to be a page. He was a son of the hand, which gave him a certain status, but also made him a target for those who resented his father's rise. He learned to keep his own counsel, to speak only when necessary, to observe more than he revealed. It was a lesson that would serve him well in the years to come. Though at the time it must have felt like a cage, the Hightower household settled into the Red Keep, and slowly the family began to weave itself into the fabric of the court. Otto's eldest daughter, Alicent, was already catching the eye of the king's son, Prince Viserys. She was young, barely more than a child, but she was clever and graceful, and she understood the importance of appearances. Gwayne watched his sister navigate the same treacherous waters he was learning to swim in, and he saw how she used her charm to build bridges, to soften the edges of their father's ambition. But the court was not a place for sentiment. Every kindness was a transaction, every smile a negotiation. Gwayne learned that the men who laughed with you at dinner could be the same men who whispered against you at dawn. He learned that the king's favour was a fragile thing, subject to the whims of age and illness. He learned that the succession was not a matter of law alone, but of power, of who could command the loyalty of the lords and the dragons. In those early years, Gwayne was a shadow in the Red Keep, a young man learning the ropes of a game that would define his life. He trained in the yard, honing his skills with sword and shield, preparing for the day when he would be called upon to defend his family's honour. He attended feasts and tourneys, watching the great knights of the realm display their prowess. He saw men like Sir Criston, a common-born knight who rose through sheer skill and determination, and he understood that the path to glory was not reserved for the highborn alone. But the Red Keep was also a place of isolation. The walls were thick, the windows narrow, and the corridors seemed to stretch on forever. Gwayne was surrounded by people, yet he was often alone. His father was consumed by the duties of the hand, his mother was occupied with the household, and his siblings were each carving their own paths. He was the youngest, the spare, the one who would have to find his own way, and so he did. He threw himself into his training, into the study of history and strategy, into the art of courtly behaviour. He learned to read the room, to gauge the mood of the court, to know when to advance and when to retreat. He learned that the Hightower ambition was not a burden, but a gift, a legacy that he could carry forward in his own way. The Red Keep became his home, but it was never a safe one. The walls held secrets, the floors held bloodstains, and the air held the whispers of 1,000 conspiracies. Gwayne Hightower entered that world as a boy, and he would leave it as a man shaped by its fire. The Hightower ambition had begun to entwine with Targaryen destiny, and there was no turning back. The game was set, the pieces were moving, and the young knight was learning to play. The Red Keep was not Oldtown. That was the first lesson young Gwayne Hightower learned. And he learned it not from a maester or a septon, but from the air itself. In Oldtown, the air was thick with salt and incense, with the slow chime of the starry sept bells and the rustle of maesters' robes. In King's Landing, the air was different. It carried the smell of the black water, yes, but also something sharper, something metallic, like the tang of a blade just before it's sheathed. Gwayne was barely a boy when his father, Sir Otto Hightower, was named Hand of the King. The year was 101 after Aegon's conquest, and the realm was still humming from the great council at Harrenhal, where the lords of Westeros had chosen Viserys over Rhaenys. The Hightower family, mother and children, travelled the Rose Road north, leaving the White Tower of their ancestors behind. For Gwayne, it was an adventure. For his sister Alicent, it was the beginning of a path that would lead to the Iron Throne. For Otto, it was the culmination of decades of careful manoeuvring. But for a boy, the court was a maze of stone corridors and hidden alcoves, of servants who moved like ghosts and lords who smiled with their teeth. Gwayne was the youngest of Alicent's brothers, and in the shadow of his father's ambition, he learned to watch. He learned to listen. He learned that a word spoken in the wrong ear could undo a lifetime of work. The royal ceremonies were the first great spectacle. King Jaehaerys, the Old as he was called, was nearing the end of his long reign, but the court still observed the ancient traditions. The lighting of the candles in the sept, the processions through the throne room, the feasts where the food was carved by knights in gleaming armour. Gwayne stood with his brothers and sister, dressed in the green and gold of their house, and watched the lords and ladies bow and curtsy. He saw how the queen, good Queen Alicent, would pause to speak to a lesser lord, and how that lord would later be seen smiling, his fortune made. He saw how a knight who stumbled during a ceremony would find himself assigned to a distant garrison within a moon's turn. The courtly rivalries were quieter. They were the whispers in the gardens, the glances exchanged over goblets of Dornish red. Gwayne's father Otto was a master of this game. He never raised his voice. He never showed his hand. But Gwayne saw how the other lords deferred to him, how they sought his favour, how they feared his displeasure. He saw how his father would invite a rival to a private dinner, and how that rival would leave the table pale and sweating. The boy began to understand that the Hightower name was not just a name. It was a shield and a sword, a key and a lock. But the most dangerous lessons were the whispered alliances. Gwayne would be playing in the corridors, chasing a cat or a servant's child, and he would hear voices from behind a door, voices that stopped when footsteps approached, voices that spoke of the succession, of the king's health, of the ambitions of the Velaryons and the Targaryens. He learned to be still. He learned to breathe shallowly. He learned that the most important conversations were never held in the open. One evening, he was walking with his sister, Alicent, through the gardens near the Godswood. She was older, quieter, her eyes always scanning the shadows. She pointed to a pair of lords standing by the fountain, their heads close together. "Do you see them?" she asked. Gwayne nodded. "They are friends today," she said, "but tomorrow, one of them will betray the other, and our father will know before either of them does." Gwayne looked at his sister, and for the first time, he saw the weight she carried. She was not just a daughter of House Hightower. She was a piece on a board, and the game was already being played. It was in this world that Gwayne's confidence was forged, not from arrogance, though that would come later, but from the simple fact of his birth. He was a Hightower of Oldtown, a house that had stood for thousands of years, that had seen dragons rise and fall, that had funded the citadel and sheltered the faith. When he walked into a room, the lords knew his name. When he spoke, the servants listened. He had never known hunger, never known defeat, never known the cold sting of being overlooked. His father was the hand of the king. His sister was the queen's closest companion. His blood was the blood of the Hightower, and that blood opened doors, but it also closed them. The other children at court, the sons and daughters of lesser houses, watched him with wary eyes. They knew he was not one of them. He was the son of the man who could make or break their fathers. So they smiled, and they bowed, and they whispered behind his back. Gwayne learned to smile back. He learned to bow. He learned to whisper. The boy from Oldtown was becoming a creature of the Red Keep. And then one day the old king died. Jaehaerys I, the conciliator, the longest reigning Targaryen, passed from the world. The bells of the great Sept of Baelor tolled for 7 days. The lords gathered for the coronation of Viserys I, and in the chaos of that transition, Gwayne saw something he had never seen before: fear. The lords who had been confident were now pale and uncertain. The alliances that had seemed so solid were now fraying. The smiles were gone, replaced by tight lips and darting eyes. He was standing in the throne room, watching the new king ascend the Iron Throne. When his father's hand landed on his shoulder, Otto leaned down, his voice low. "Remember this day, Gwayne. This is the day the game truly begins." The boy looked up at the throne, at the twisted swords and the jagged edges, and he understood. The court was not a place of safety. It was a place of war, fought with words and wine and wedding vows. And he was a soldier, whether he liked it or not. The years passed. Gwayne grew taller, stronger, more skilled with a sword. He trained in the yard with the other knights, learning to ride and to fight. He watched his father navigate the shifting currents of the court, and he watched his sister Alicent rise, from the king's companion to his queen. He saw how the birth of a son, Aegon II, changed everything. He saw how the arrival of Princess Rhaenyra's own children, the strong boys, sowed the seeds of discord. He saw the smiles grow sharper, the whispers louder, the alliances more desperate. And through it all, Gwayne remained a Hightower. He was not the heir to Oldtown, not the hand, not the queen. He was the youngest son, the spare, the knight, who would one day serve. But in the crucible of the Red Keep, he had learned the most important lesson of all: that a smile at court may be sharper than a sword, and that the boy who learned to read the room, to hear the silence, to see the fear behind the eyes, would be the one who survived. As the realm drifted toward war, as the whispers became shouts, and the alliances became armies, Gwayne Hightower stood ready. He had been shaped by the ceremonies, the rivalries, the whispered secrets of the most dangerous court in the world. And now, he would prove that the lessons of his childhood were not forgotten. They were etched into his bones as deep as the Hightower itself. The boy who had learned to read a room before he could read a letter, who had watched lords and ladies trade compliments like poisoned wine, now stood at the edge of something far larger than any tourney or feast. Gwayne Hightower had spent his childhood in the Red Keep, but he had never seen his sister wear a crown. That was about to change. In the year 106 after Aegon's conquest, King Viserys the First Targaryen found himself a widower. Queen Aemma Arryn had died in childbirth, along with their son Balon, leaving the realm without a clear heir. The king grieved deeply, but a king cannot mourn forever, and the small council began to whisper of remarriage. The realm needed a queen. More than that, the realm needed a son. Otto Hightower saw the opportunity before anyone else did. As Hand of the King, he had the king's ear, and he used it with the precision of a maester's scalpel. He spoke of duty, of stability, of the need for a queen who understood the weight of the crown. And he spoke of his daughter Alicent, who had grown up in the Red Keep, who had read to the king in his grief, who had been a comfort to him in his darkest hours. Alicent Hightower was barely 18 years old when she married King Viserys I. The ceremony took place in the Great Sept of Baelor, and the streets of King's Landing ran with wine and celebration. But beneath the cheers and the bells, something shifted in the foundations of the realm. The Hightower family had not merely climbed the ladder of courtly influence, they had planted themselves at the very root of the Iron Throne. Gwayne stood among the crowd in the sept, watching his sister walk down the aisle in a gown of green and gold. She looked like a queen, but she also looked like a girl, playing a role she had never rehearsed. He remembered her as the sister who had braided his hair when they were children, who had taught him the names of the stars from the tower windows of Oldtown. Now she was about to become the mother of princes, the consort of a dragon lord, the centre of a storm that had not yet broken. The marriage was not just a union of two people, it was a declaration. House Hightower had become inseparable from the future of the Targaryen succession. Otto Hightower had already been Hand of the King. Now his blood would sit on the throne itself. The green flame of the Hightower had reached the Iron Throne, and the fire of the dragons would burn in the veins of Alicent's children. But the court did not welcome this change with open arms. Princess Rhaenyra Targaryen, the king's only surviving child from his first marriage, had been named heir to the Iron Throne. She was a dragon rider, a daughter of the realm, and she had been raised to believe that one day she would rule. Now her father had remarried, and the whispers began. Would the king set aside his daughter for a new son? Would the realm be torn apart by a succession crisis before the queen even gave birth? Gwayne watched these tensions from the edges of the court. He was not yet a knight, not yet a commander, not yet a man of any real consequence, but he was a Hightower, and that name carried weight. He saw how the lords and ladies looked at his sister, how they measured her every word, how they calculated her every gesture. He saw how they looked at him too, the youngest brother of the queen, a boy who might one day be useful or dangerous, depending on how the game played out. Alicent's transformation into queen was not instantaneous. It was a slow, deliberate process, like the carving of a statue from marble. She learned to speak with the authority of a ruler, to smile when she wanted to weep, to hold her tongue when every nerve screamed for her to speak. She surrounded herself with ladies of her own choosing, women from houses loyal to the Hightowers, women who would carry her whispers and her wishes throughout the Red Keep, and she bore children. First came Aegon, named for the conqueror, a boy with silver hair and violet eyes who was declared a prince of the realm before he could even walk. Then came Helena, a gentle girl who seemed to see things that others could not. Then Aemond, fierce and determined, a boy who would grow into a dragon rider with a fire in his blood. And finally, Dorene, the youngest, who would be sent to Oldtown to be fostered among the Hightowers. A reminder that the family's roots ran deep in the Reach. Each birth strengthened Alicent's position. Each child was a thread in the tapestry of her power, but each child also deepened the rift between the queen and the princess. Rhaenyra had married Sir Lionel Velaryon, a match that was meant to unite the Targaryens with the sea power of Driftmark. But the marriage was not a happy one, and rumours of Rhaenyra's sons being bastards spread through the court like wildfire. The Greens, as Alicent's faction came to be called, whispered that the princess was unfit to rule. The Blacks, loyal to Rhaenyra, whispered that the queen was a usurper in waiting. Gwayne did not participate in these whispers. He was not yet a player in the game, but he listened, he watched, he learned, and he began to understand that his sister's crown was not a gift, but a burden. She had been placed on a pedestal, and from that pedestal, she could see every enemy, every rival, every threat. She could also see the path ahead, a path that led through fire and blood. The Heir's tournament, in 111, after Aegon's conquest, was meant to celebrate the 5th anniversary of the king and queen's marriage. It was a grand affair, with knights from across the realm gathering to compete for glory and gold. Alicent chose her champions carefully, men who would represent her honour and her house. Among them was her brother Gwayne, now old enough to bear a lance and ride in the lists. He was unhorsed by Sir Criston Cole, the same knight who had once been Rhaenyra's sworn protector, but had since sworn his sword to the queen. The defeat was humiliating, but it was also instructive. Gwayne learned that day that skill at arms was not enough. He learned that the court was a battlefield of its own, and that a fall from a horse could be forgotten, but a fall from favour could be fatal. Criston Cole rose in prominence after that tourney. He became the Queen's champion, a most trusted knight, the man who would lead the Green's armies when war finally came. Gwayne would serve under him, would fight beside him, would clash with him over matters of honour and duty. But in that moment, all Gwayne felt was the sting of defeat and the dust of the tourney ground. The years passed. The king grew older, frailer, more dependent on the milk of the poppy to ease his pain. Alicent became the true power behind the throne, managing the small council, guiding her husband's decisions, preparing her son Aegon for the crown that she believed was his by right. The Hightower family had risen higher than any house in the Reach had ever risen. But the higher they climbed, the harder the fall would be. Gwayne watched his sister transform from a girl into a queen, from a queen into a politician, from a politician into a ruler who would stop at nothing to protect her children. He saw the steel beneath her silk, the fire beneath her calm, and he knew that when the time came, he would stand beside her, not because he was ambitious, but because she was his sister, and the blood of the Hightower ran through both of them. The court divided around her. The Greens and the Blacks drew their lines, sharp and clear, like the edge of a Valyrian steel blade. Lords and ladies chose their sides, some for love, some for fear, some for gold. Gwayne chose his side the moment he saw his sister crowned, the moment he heard the cheers of the crowd, the moment he felt the weight of the Hightower name settle on his shoulders. He would not be a king, he would not be a hand, but he would be a knight, a commander, a man who could be counted on when the swords were drawn and the dragons took flight. And as he stood in the shadow of the Iron Throne, watching his sister rule, he knew that the story of House Hightower was far from over. The green flame still burned, and it would burn until the end of days. But before that end, there would be battles to fight, oaths to keep, and a war that would tear the realm apart. And Gwayne Hightower would be there, sword in hand, ready to defend the crown that his sister had worn, the crown that had cost her everything. And so, as Queen Alicent's star rose over the Red Keep, another Hightower was quietly learning the lessons of power in a very different arena. While his sister navigated the whispers of the court, Gwayne Hightower was being shaped by the clang of steel and the roar of the tawny crowd. He was, in every visible way, a knight made for display. To understand Gwayne is to understand the culture of the tournament field in the heyday of the Targaryen peace. For the sons of great houses, especially the second and third sons who would never inherit lands or titles, the tourney was the great stage. It was a place where a young man could win fame, fortune, and the favour of a highborn lady without ever facing the true horror of war. The lists were a controlled violence, a dance with rules, where a well-placed lance could elevate a name for a generation. And Gwayne Hightower, the youngest brother of the Queen, was born for this stage. He was the polished image of Hightower chivalry, handsome, proud, well-born and eager for notice. He had the look of a man who had spent his life being told he was the best, and he believed it. The Hightowers of Oldtown were not just wealthy, they were the custodians of the Citadel and the Starry Sept, the very heart of Andal learning and faith. To be a Hightower knight was to carry the weight of that legacy, and Gwayne wore it like a finely tailored cloak. He seemed to believe that honour could be worn as elegantly as a cloak, that it was a matter of fine manners, a perfect tilt, and a graceful bow to the Queen's box. And indeed, he had every reason to be confident. The 5th anniversary of King Viserys and Queen Alicent's marriage was celebrated with a grand tourney in 111 AC. It was a day of pageantry, a showcase for the realm's finest warriors. Gwayne rode into the lists as one of his sister's champions, a public declaration of Hightower strength. He was young, he was eager, and he was about to meet the man who would define so much of his future. The man who unhorsed him that day was a knight of the Kingsguard named Ser Criston Cole. It was a moment that established Cole's rising prominence. But for Gwayne, it was a humiliation. To be thrown from the saddle in front of the entire court, in front of his sister the Queen, was a wound to that carefully polished pride. It was the first crack in the armour of a man who believed that reputation was everything, but the tourney was not war. A fall in the lists meant a bruised ego and a sore back, not a broken body or a lost kingdom. Gwayne could brush himself off, smile, and live to ride another day. The true test of his honour, the kind that could not be worn like a cloak, was still years away. For now he remained in the shadow of his father and his sister, a handsome knight in a court that valued beauty and grace. He was a product of his upbringing, a man who had learned that a knight's worth was measured in applause and silver lances. He had not yet learned that the truest honour is forged, not in the sunlight of the field, but in the cold, dark hours when no one is watching. And that lesson, when it came, would arrive not in the form of a lance, but in the grim reality of a kingdom at war with itself. The Stepstones campaign would be that grim reality. When the call came for the realm to support Prince Daemon and Lord Corlys in their war against the Triarchy, many young knights saw it as a chance for glory. Gwayne Hightower was among them. He rode south with a contingent of reachmen, his armour polished, his horse caparisoned in the green and flame of his house. He expected a grand adventure, a chance to prove himself against a real enemy, to wash away the memory of that fall in the lists with the blood of pirates. But the Stepstones were not a tourney field. There was no herald to announce his entrance, no queen to smile from a high box. There was only the sun, the salt, and the endless grinding skirmishes on barren rocks. The war was a slow, miserable affair of ambushes and sieges, of men dying from fever and infection more often than from a clean lance through the heart. For Gwayne, this was a harsh awakening. The enemy did not care about his name or his family's legacy. They did not bow when he raised his sword. They fought from behind rocks, with poisoned arrows and rusty blades. He learned that honour on a battlefield is not a cloak you wear, but a weight you carry. He saw men he had trained with fall beside him, their armour no protection against a well-aimed crossbow bolt. He saw the fear in their eyes, and he felt it in his own gut. The polished image of the tawny knight began to crack, revealing something harder underneath. He survived the campaign, but he did not return to King's Landing as the same man. The applause of the court felt hollow now. He had seen what true violence looked like, and it had no grace. He had learned that the truest measure of a knight is not how he falls, but how he rises after the fall, and how he fights when there is no one left to applaud. This lesson would serve him well in the years to come. For the Dance of the Dragons was not a war fought on distant rocks. It was a fire that would consume the very heart of the realm, and Gwayne Hightower would be forced to choose a side, not for glory, but for survival. And when that choice came, he would remember the salt and the sun and the screams of dying men, and he would know that the tourney was over. The real game had begun. The previous chapter left Gwayne Hightower as a knight made for display, a polished figure of Hightower chivalry, standing at the edge of a stage built for spectacle. Tournaments in the Seven Kingdoms were where young noble sons could win fame without facing war's true horror, and Gwayne had been groomed for exactly that kind of glory. He was handsome, proud, born and eager for notice, but notice required an audience, and in the year 111 after Aegon's conquest, the realm gathered to give him one. That year marked the 5th anniversary of King Viserys I's marriage to Queen Alicent Hightower, and the court celebrated with a grand tournament. It was a festival of chivalry held in the fields outside King's Landing, a sprawling display of silk pavilions, blunted lances, and the roar of thousands of spectators. The king and queen sat beneath a canopy of gold and crimson, surrounded by lords and ladies from every corner of the realm. The air smelled of horses and roasted meat, of sweat and perfume, of anticipation. For 5 days, the finest knights of Westeros would ride against each other in the melee, the joust, and the archery contest. And at the center of it, all stood the champions of the Queen. Queen Alicent, now 5 years into her marriage, had chosen her champions carefully. They were men who reflected her household's prestige, men whose victories would honor her name. Among them was her youngest brother, Sir Gwayne Hightower. He carried the weight of his sister's station on his shoulders, the silver and flame sigil of House Hightower emblazoned on his shield. To be a queen's champion was no small thing. It meant that every eye in the crowd would watch him, that every victory would be hers, and every defeat would be whispered about in the corridors of the Red Keep for years to come. Gwayne rode into the lists with the confidence of a man who had never known true failure. He was young, barely past his 15th name day, but he had been trained by the finest masters at arms in Oldtown. He wore armor polished to a mirror shine, a cloak of Hightower green flowing from his shoulders. The crowd cheered as he took his position, and he raised his lance in salute to the Queen. She smiled, but her smile was careful. She knew what it meant to put a brother in the path of glory and danger. The joust began with the thunder of hooves and the crack of wood. Knights from across the realm competed, each seeking to prove themselves before the assembled might of the crown. Lord Corlys Velaryon's men rode in sea green and silver. The princes of House Targaryen watched from the royal box, and among the competitors, a knight of the Kingsguard caught everyone's attention. Sir Criston Cole, the Dornishman, who had risen from obscurity to become the king's sworn shield, had entered the lists. He was already a figure of fascination, a man whose skill with a sword had earned him the white cloak. But in the joust, he was something else entirely. Gwayne Hightower faced Sir Criston Cole in the 3rd round of the joust. It was a matchup that drew gasps from the crowd, for here was the Queen's brother against the King's protector. The two men lowered their lances, and the signal was given. Horses surged forward, hooves pounding the earth. The lances struck almost simultaneously, but Cole's aim was true. His lance caught Gwayne square in the chest, lifting him from the saddle and sending him crashing to the ground. The crowd erupted, half in shock, half in applause. Gwayne lay in the dirt, his armor dented, his pride wounded far deeper than his body. He rose, of course. He had to. A Hightower does not stay down, but the moment was etched into the memory of everyone who witnessed it. Sir Criston Cole had unhorsed the Queen's brother, and in doing so, he had announced himself as a force to be reckoned with. For Gwayne, it was a bitter lesson. The tournament was not merely a game. It was a stage where reputations were made and broken, where a single fall could echo through the years. Yet the tournament of 111 AC was not just about Gwayne's defeat. It was about the gathering of the realm, the celebration of a union that had reshaped the succession. Viserys and Alicent had produced children by then, heirs and spares, who would one day claim the Iron Throne. The tournament was a display of unity, a show of strength meant to reassure the lords of Westeros that the crown was secure, but beneath the banners and the music, tension simmered. Princess Rhaenyra, the king's daughter from his first marriage, sat in the royal box with her own champions. She was the heir to the throne, named by her father years earlier, and her presence was a reminder that the succession was not as settled as the celebration suggested. Gwayne, for his part, did not dwell on his loss. He was young, and youth has a way of brushing off humiliation. He returned to the lists the next day, riding in the melee with a ferocity that earned him grudging respect. He fought alongside his fellow champions, his sword flashing in the afternoon sun. He was not the victor of the tournament, but he was not forgotten either. He had shown the realm that he was willing to bleed for his sister's honour, and that counted for something in the courts of King's Landing. The tournament ended with a grand feast, where the victors were toasted and the losers nursed their wounds. Gwayne sat at the high table, his armour replaced by silk and velvet, his face composed into a mask of courtly grace. He watched Sir Criston Cole accept the champion's laurels, and he filed away the memory of that fall. It would not be the last time their paths crossed, but for now, the tournament was over, and the realm returned to the slow dance of politics and power. As the pavilions were dismantled and the knights rode home, Gwayne Hightower remained in King's Landing. He had come to the capital as a boy seeking glory, and he left the tournament grounds as a young man who had learned that glory was never free. The cheers of the crowd faded, but the lessons of the lists stayed with him. He would carry that knowledge into the years ahead, into a world where tournaments gave way to war, and where the stakes were no longer about a queen's favour, but about survival itself. The lists of champions had been announced days before the first lance was couched, and the name Gwayne Hightower was among those spoken with particular reverence. He was young, yes, but he was also the brother of the Queen, the son of the Hand, and a knight of House Hightower, a name that carried weight from Oldtown to the Wall. When he rode into the lists on the morning of the third day, his armour gleamed with silver and pale green, the colours of his house, and the crowd recognised him at once. He was one of Queen Alicent's champions, chosen to defend her honour in the tournament that celebrated 5 years of her marriage to King Viserys. The stands were packed with lords and ladies from across the realm, and the sun sat high and warm over the tawny grounds. Gwayne took his position at the far end of the tilt, his destrier stamping and snorting beneath him. He raised his lance and saluted the royal box, where his sister sat beside the king, her face composed but her eyes bright with pride. He had trained for this moment his entire life. In the yards of Oldtown, he had been taught by master-at-arms who had trained generations of Hightower knights. He knew the weight of a lance, the angle of a shield, the precise moment to rise in the stirrups and drive the point home. He was ready. Across the field, his opponent was already mounted. The man was not unknown to the court, but he was not of the great houses. He wore the white cloak of the Kingsguard, and his armour was plain, unadorned by crest or motto. His name was Sir Criston Cole, and he had been a sworn brother of the Kingsguard for only a few years. He was the son of the steward of Blackhaven, a man of no noble birth, and he had risen to his position through skill alone. The court had taken notice of him, but they had not yet decided what to make of him. He was a curiosity, a commoner in white, and the highborn knights of the realm still regarded him as an outsider. The herald's trumpet sounded. The two knights lowered their lances and spurred their horses forward. The hooves thundered against the packed earth, and the crowd leaned forward as one. Gwayne held his lance steady, his eyes fixed on the gap between Criston's shield and his helm. He had practiced this strike 1,000 times. He knew exactly where to aim, but Criston Cole did not follow the pattern. At the last moment, he shifted his weight, and his lance dipped lower than Gwayne had anticipated. The impact came not against Gwayne's shield, but against his chest, just below the gorget. The force of the blow lifted him from his saddle, and for a long, terrible moment, he hung suspended in the air, his arms flailing, his lance spinning away. Then he hit the ground, and the world became a blur of dust and pain. The crowd gasped. Then they cheered. They cheered for Criston Cole, the common knight who had unhorsed a Hightower. Gwayne lay in the dirt, his pride shattered more thoroughly than any bone. He could hear the applause, the shouts, the laughter from the stands. He could feel the eyes of the court upon him, and he knew that this moment would be remembered. He would be remembered not as the champion of Queen Alicent, but as the man who fell before Sir Criston Cole. He rose slowly, his armour scraping against the ground. His squire rushed to him, offering a hand, but Gwayne waved him away. He stood on his own, though his legs trembled, and he removed his helm. The air was cool against his flushed face. He looked across the field, and there was Criston Cole, still mounted, his lance raised in acknowledgement of the crowd. He did not gloat. He did not even look at Gwayne. He simply rode back to his end of the tilt, ready for his next opponent. And that, perhaps, was the most humiliating part of all. To Criston Cole, this was just another victory. To Gwayne, it was a public undoing. The tournament continued, and Criston Cole would go on to defeat knight after knight, eventually being named the champion of the day. He would be awarded the laurels, and he would kneel before Queen Alicent to receive her favour. And Gwayne would watch from the sidelines, his armour still dusty, his pride still wounded. He would smile, because he had been raised to smile at court, but the smile would not reach his eyes. In that moment, the comfortable hierarchy of noble birth was disrupted. Gwayne Hightower, son of the Hand, brother of the Queen, had been bested by a man whose father managed a castle. The court would not forget it, and neither would Gwayne. This was the first seed of a rivalry that would return in far darker circumstances. In the years to come, when the realm was torn apart by war, Gwayne and Criston would find themselves on the same side, fighting for the same cause. But the memory of that fall would never fade. It would linger between them, unspoken but ever present, a shadow that followed them from the tourney grounds to the battlefield. For now, though, the sun continued to shine, and the wine continued to flow, and the court of King Viserys remained a place of pageantry and pleasure. Gwayne returned to his chambers that evening, his body bruised, his mind churning. He was young, and he was proud, and he had learned a lesson that no master-at-arms could have taught him. He had learned that the world did not care about his name. It cared about what he could do, and what he could do at that moment was not enough. He would spend the next years of his life trying to prove otherwise. He would train harder, ride farther, fight with more ferocity. He would seek out every opportunity to demonstrate his worth. But the memory of that fall would remain, a crack in the armour of his confidence, a reminder that even a Hightower could be brought low. The tournament of 111 AC ended, and the court moved on to other matters. There were feasts and hunts and councils to attend. Gwayne continued to serve as a knight of the Queen's household, but he was no longer the same man who had ridden into the lists with such certainty. He had been humbled, and humility, in a court full of pride, was a dangerous thing. It was also, in its own way, a gift. It taught him to watch, to listen, to measure his opponents before he engaged them. It taught him that the world was full of men like Criston Cole, men who had risen from nothing and would stop at nothing. And it taught him that the Game of Thrones was not played only in the throne room. It was played in the tilt yard, in the training yard, in every glance and every word. Gwayne Hightower would not forget the day he fell. And when the war came, and the stakes were no longer about honour, but about survival, he would carry that memory with him. It would shape his choices, his alliances, his very understanding of what it meant to be a knight. But that was still years away. For now the dust settled, the cheers faded, and the court of King Viserys returned to its careful dance of ambition and deceit. And Gwayne, bruised and quiet, began to learn the steps. Before we dive deeper into this incredible journey, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop a comment below and let our global community know. And if you're finding this as mind-blowing as I am, hit that like button to help more people discover this story. The dust had barely settled on the tawny field before the whispers began. For a knight of Gwayne Hightower standing, the fall itself was not the deepest wound. It was the memory of it, carried forward into every hall, every feast, every council chamber, where men of noble birth measured one another by the weight of their reputations. In aristocratic Westeros, a public defeat is never just a single moment. It lingers. It becomes a story told by others, repeated at your expense, until the name of the victor is etched alongside your own humiliation. Gwayne Hightower was born into a house that had shaped the history of the Reach for millennia. The Hightowers of Oldtown did not need to prove their worth through feats of arms. Their legacy was written in stone and candlelight in the libraries of the Citadel and the halls of the Starry Sept. But on that day in 111 AC, when the 5th anniversary of King Viserys and Queen Alicent's marriage was celebrated with a grand tournament, Gwayne rode onto the field not as a scholar or a diplomat, but as a champion. He carried the colours of his sister, the Queen, and the expectations of a family that had placed him among the most visible knights in the realm. And then came Criston Cole. Cole was not born to privilege. He was the son of a steward, a man who had earned his knighthood through years of service and skill, not through inheritance or alliance. When he unseated Gwayne, the crowd did not see a nobleman humbled by a superior warrior. They saw the old order challenged. They saw a man who had fought his way into the lists, defeat a man who had been placed there by birth. For the courtiers watching from the galleries, the moment was a spectacle. For Gwayne, it was a lesson in the fragility of earned respect. The long memory of insult is a burden carried quietly. Gwayne did not rage publicly. He did not demand a rematch or question Cole's honour, but the sting of that defeat followed him through the years. A shadow cast by a man who had risen far above his station. In the world of the Red Keep, where every glance and every whispered word could carry the weight of a dagger, Gwayne learned that pride is a currency that must be spent carefully. A public fall does not end with the tournament. It becomes part of your story, and stories in Westeros are never forgotten. Criston Cole, meanwhile, became a figure of growing renown. His victory over Gwayne was not his first triumph, nor his last. He went on to win the melee and the archery contest that same day, cementing his reputation as one of the finest knights in the Seven Kingdoms. His skill was undeniable, his discipline unshakable, and yet for all his prowess, he remained an outsider in the eyes of the highborn. He was a man who had earned his place through blood and sweat, but the lords and ladies of the court never quite forgot that he had not been born to it. The contrast between Gwayne and Cole is not simply one of skill or status. It is a reflection of a deeper tension in Westerosi society, the resentment between old privilege and earned power. Gwayne represented everything that the established order held sacred: lineage, tradition, the unspoken assumption that noble blood carried with it a natural superiority. Cole represented the possibility that a man could rise through merit alone, that the Game of Thrones was not closed to those who were willing to fight for it. Their tournament encounter became a quiet symbol of this divide. On the surface, it was a single tilt between two knights, a moment of sport that would be forgotten by most within a year. But for those who understood the currents of power in King's Landing, it was a reminder that the old certainties were fraying. The Hightowers had built their influence on centuries of careful alliance and strategic marriage. But they could not control the rise of a man like Criston Cole. They could not prevent a knight of humble birth from challenging their place in the hierarchy. In the years that followed, Gwayne remained a loyal son of House Hightower. He served in the City Watch, he stood by his father and his sister, and he carried himself with the dignity expected of his name. But the memory of that fall never truly left him. It shaped his interactions with Cole, adding a layer of tension to every encounter. When the Dance of the Dragons began, and the Greens and Blacks turned the realm into a battlefield, Gwayne found himself serving alongside the very man who had humiliated him decades earlier. The old resentment simmered beneath the surface, A reminder that in Westeros, the past is never truly past. Criston Cole, for his part, seemed to carry no such weight. He had moved on to greater victories and greater responsibilities. But for Gwayne, the fall before Cole was not just a defeat. It was a wound that refused to heal, a lesson in the cost of pride and the permanence of public shame. In the end, the knight who could not forget was not defined by his fall, but by what he carried forward from it. The memory of that fall in 111 never truly faded. For Gwayne Hightower, the dust of the tawny ground had settled, but the sting of being unhorsed before the court, before his sister, the Queen, before every lord and lady who mattered, lingered like a splinter beneath the skin. He was a Hightower of Oldtown, born to the second most powerful house in the realm, and he had been thrown from his saddle by a man with no name, no lands, no birth worth mentioning. Criston Cole had risen from nothing, and in that single moment, he had taken something from Gwayne that could never be returned, the easy assumption of superiority that came with being a Hightower. But the years passed, as years do, and the court moved on. The tournament of 111 became a memory, then a footnote, then a story told to children who had not been born yet. Gwayne did not remain in King's Landing to watch Cole's star rise further. In the world of the books he stayed, serving in the City Watch, a steady if unremarkable officer of the Gold Cloaks. But the show gives us a different path, a more isolated one, and it is this version we turn to now. In the television adaptation, Gwayne Hightower does not linger in the shadow of the Iron Throne. Instead, he returns to Oldtown, the ancient seat of his house, and remains there for decades. This is not a small detail. It reshapes everything we understand about him. Oldtown is not merely a city. It is the heart of learning in Westeros, home to the Citadel where maesters are forged, and the Starry Sept where the faith of the Seven holds its greatest power. It is a place of stone and candlelight, of quiet corridors and long traditions, and for Gwayne, it becomes a kind of exile. Though he would never call it that, think of the distance this creates. His sister Alicent is in King's Landing, crowned queen, mother to princes, the most powerful woman in the realm. She is at the centre of everything: court intrigue, royal succession, the slow burn of a war that has not yet been named. And Gwayne is in Oldtown, far from the whispers of the Red Keep, far from the councils where fates are decided. He is not there for the birth of her children. He is not there when Viserys begins to fail, when the factions harden, when the cracks in the realm become chasms. He is a brother left behind, and the years stretch between them like a long road. When he finally rides for King's Landing in the second season, the journey takes 3 months. 3 months on horseback, through the Reach, past the borders of the Crownlands, watching the landscape change from the green fields of the south to the more guarded terrain around the capital. 3 months to think about what he will find when he arrives. His sister is no longer the girl he remembers. She is Queen Alicent, a woman shaped by loss and duty, and the impossible weight of protecting her children. And he is no longer the young knight who rode in tournaments for her honour. He is a man of 40 years, seasoned by the quiet life of Oldtown, carrying with him the judgments of a house that has watched from a distance. This is the key to understanding the show's Gwayne. He returns not merely as kin, not as a brother eager to embrace his sister, but as a Hightower observer. He has been sent by his family, by the older generation that still holds power in Oldtown, to watch, to report, to ensure that House Hightower's interests are not forgotten in the chaos of King's Landing. He is a pair of eyes that belong to the South, a reminder that the Hightowers are not merely servants of the crown, but a power in their own right, with their own ambitions and their own pride. And so when he arrives, he does not step quietly into the background. He is arrogant, yes, outspoken, flamboyant, in the way that Oldtown nobility often is, accustomed to being the most important person in any room south of the Neck. But he is also naive. He has not lived through the slow corrosion of the court. He has not watched the greens and blacks sharpen their knives. He comes to a city that is already at war, and he carries with him the assumptions of a man who has never seen a real battle, only the pageantry of tourneys. This naivete will be tested. In the third season, him confront Criston Cole, not about the old humiliation, but about something far more serious. The army has been moving through the Riverlands, and the men have been taking what they want from village women. Gwayne does not look away. He speaks, directly, forcefully, arguing that knights are not beasts, that their oaths of chastity mean something, that honour is not a word to be discarded when it becomes inconvenient. It is a moment of moral growth, a shift from the arrogant nobleman to a warrior who understands that the true test of a knight is not how well he rides in a tourney, but how he treats those who cannot defend themselves. Criston Cole, of course, does not take this well. The old tension between them, the memory of that fall in 111, still simmers beneath the surface. But now it is not about who is the better rider. It is about who understands what this war truly means. Gwayne, for all his flaws, is beginning to see that the Dance of Dragons is not a Game of Thrones played by noble houses. It is a fire that consumes everything, and those who stand too close will be burned. The distance between siblings, then, is not only measured in miles. It is measured in experience, in the things one has seen and the other has not. Alicent has spent decades in the Red Keep, watching her husband decay, watching her father scheme, watching her children become pawns in a game she never wanted to play. Gwayne has spent those decades in Oldtown, among the maesters and the septons, in a city that values order and tradition. When they meet again, they are so strangers wearing the faces of family, and the conversation between them is filled with everything that has not been said. This is the strange truth of the Hightower siblings. They are bound by blood, by the name they share, by the expectations of their house, but they are also separated by the lives they have lived. And the distance between Oldtown and King's Landing is not just a journey of 3 months. It is the space between two different worlds, and Gwayne must now find his place in the one he has been sent to observe. The distance between Oldtown and King's Landing was not merely measured in leagues. For Gwayne Hightower, it had become a gulf of years, of silence, of a life lived in the shadow of a tower, while his sister and father shaped the fate of the realm from the Red Keep. He had grown into a man in the shadow of the Hightower, a knight trained in the yards of Oldtown, polished by the Citadel's learning, but removed from the court's whispers and conspiracies. When word finally reached him that King Viserys had died, it came not as a shock, but as a tremor felt across the entire continent. The old king had been failing for years, his body slowly surrendering to the rot that had consumed him from within. But his death was not merely the end of a reign. It was the spark that would ignite a fire no one could contain. The death of King Viserys turned old succession tensions into open conflict. For years the court had been divided, a silent war fought with glances and whispered alliances. Viserys had named Rhaenyra his heir, and for a time that declaration had held the peace. But the birth of Alicent's sons had changed everything. Aegon, Aemond, Daeron, each one a male claimant, each one a challenge to the princess's birthright. And when Viserys finally slipped away in his sleep, the council chambers of the Red Keep became the stage for a coup. Alicent's children were crowned in defiance of Rhaenyra, drawing House Hightower into the centre of the dance. The coronation of Aegon II was swift, secretive, and absolute. The small council acted before Rhaenyra could even learn of her father's passing, and at the heart of that decision stood Otto Hightower, the hand of the king, the father of the queen, the architect of the Green Cause. Gwayne's family loyalty became inseparable from the Green Cause. He had not been present for the plotting, the whispered conversations in the dead of night, the careful arrangement of alliances. He had been in Oldtown, training, waiting, living a life that seemed increasingly distant from the affairs of the capital. But blood called to blood, and when the summons came, Gwayne answered. He rode for King's Landing not as a stranger arriving at a foreign court, but as a son returning to a house at war. The journey took 3 months, a long and deliberate march that gave him time to think, to prepare, to steel himself for what lay ahead. When he finally passed through the gates of the Red Keep, he found a city transformed. The gold cloaks patrolled the streets with new urgency. The banners of House Targaryen hung alongside those of House Hightower, and the air itself seemed charged with the anticipation of violence. Gwayne's arrival was not met with universal warmth. His father, Otto, received him with the measured approval of a man who had long since learned to trust no one fully. His sister Alicent embraced him with the desperate relief of a queen who needed every ally she could find. But there were others in the court who saw Gwayne as an interloper, a latecomer to a war that had already begun. Chief among them was Sir Criston Cole, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, the man who had unhorsed Gwayne at the Heir's tournament years before. That memory lingered between them, an old wound that had never fully healed. Cole had risen from nothing to become the most feared knight in the realm, while Gwayne had been born into privilege and then left to languish in the provinces. Now they were allies in the same cause, but the tension between them was palpable, a quiet rivalry that simmered beneath the surface of every council meeting and every war council. Gwayne's role in the Green cause was not immediately clear. He was a knight, certainly, but he had not seen true battle. His experience was limited to tourneys and training yards, the safe and structured violence of noble sport. The war that loomed before them was something else entirely. It would not be fought with lances and heraldry, but with fire and blood. The Blacks had dragons. The Greens had dragons too, but fewer, and their riders were younger, less experienced. Rhaenyra's faction controlled Dragonstone and the loyalty of the North, the Riverlands and the Vale. The Greens held King's Landing, the Reach and the Stormlands. The balance of power was delicate, and every sword counted. Gwayne was given command of a portion of the City Watch, the Gold Cloaks, who patrolled the streets and guarded the gates. It was a position of trust, but also of danger. The city was restless, filled with spies and sympathizers for both sides. Every shadow could hide an assassin. Every whisper could carry a plot. Gwayne took to his duties with the seriousness of a man who understood that failure meant not just his own death, but the collapse of everything his family had built. He walked the walls at night, his hand never far from his sword, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of threat. He was no longer the arrogant young knight who had been humiliated in the tourney. He was a soldier in a war that would define his family's legacy for generations. The first blows of the dance were struck not on a battlefield, but in the shadows of the Red Keep. Lord Lyman Beesbury, the Master of Coin, was murdered for refusing to support Aegon's claim. Sir Harold Westerling, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, resigned rather than break his oath to Rhaenyra. The realm fractured along lines of loyalty and blood, and House Hightower found itself at the very centre of the storm. Otto Hightower had spent years preparing for this moment, cultivating alliances, securing the loyalty of the small council, positioning his family to seize power when the opportunity arose. But even he could not have predicted the speed with which the war would escalate. Within weeks of Viserys' death, the realm was at war. Armies marched, dragons took to the sky, and the dance of the dragons began in earnest. Gwayne watched it all unfold with a mixture of pride and dread. Pride in his family's strength, in the power they had amassed, in the crown that now sat upon his nephew's head, but dread at the cost that would surely follow. He had seen enough of war to know that victory was never clean. It left scars that never healed, wounds that festered for generations, and he knew that his own role in this conflict would not be a passive one. He was a Hightower, and the Hightowers were no longer merely a noble house. They were the architects of a new order, the power behind the throne, the family that had dared to challenge the will of a dying king. The war beneath the family name had begun, and Gwayne Hightower, the knight who had once been left behind in Oldtown, was now standing at its very heart. The death of King Viserys had cracked the realm open, and from that fissure, war had begun to pour. In Oldtown, The news arrived like a slow tide, carrying with it the weight of everything that had been set in motion. Gwayne Hightower received the word in the halls of the Hightower, the ancient stone keep that had watched over the city for thousands of years. He was a man of 34 now, no longer the young knight who had been unhorsed at a tournament more than 2 decades ago. The years in Oldtown had shaped him differently than they had shaped his sister Alicent, who had been crowned queen and then queen mother in the Red Keep, or his father Otto, who had served as hand of the king through the reigns of 2 monarchs. Gwayne had remained in the Reach, a son of the Hightower who had never quite left home, but now home was calling him to war. In the show adaptation, Gwayne rides from Oldtown toward the capital as the realm begins to burn. The journey is not a short one. From the southern coast of the Reach, through the fertile plains, and across the Blackwater Rush, the road to King's Landing stretches for hundreds of miles. 3 months of riding, 3 months of watching the sky, and wondering what he would find when he arrived. The realm was already burning by the time he saddled his horse. Rhaenyra had been crowned on Dragonstone, her claim supported by the Lords of the North, the Vale, and the Riverlands. Aegon had been crowned in the Red Keep, his claim backed by the Crownlands, the Stormlands, and the Reach. The 2 queens, the 2 kings, the 2 dragons that could not share the same sky. Gwayne rode through a country that was beginning to fracture. He passed villages where the talk was of war, where farmers looked at the road with suspicion, where the banners of House Targaryen flew from castle walls, but no one could say which dragon they truly served. He slept in inns that were emptier than they should have been, ate meals that were simpler than what he was used to, and listened to the rumours that travelled faster than any rider. Some said Rhaenyra had already taken Harrenhal. Others said Aegon had sent his brother Aemond to burn the Riverlands. No one knew for certain, and in that uncertainty, the realm was beginning to tear itself apart. The long journey gives him time to imagine the family he has not seen and the war he is entering. He had not seen Alicent in years. He had not seen his nephews, Aegon and Aemond and Daeron, since they were children. He had not seen his father Otto, since the old man had been dismissed as Hand and sent back to Oldtown, only to be recalled when the crisis demanded his counsel. The faces Gwayne carried in his memory were not the faces he would find when he reached King's Landing. Alicent would be older, her hair streaked with grey, her eyes carrying the exhaustion of a woman who had spent decades navigating a court that had never fully accepted her. Aegon would be a man now, a king, though Gwayne remembered him as a boy who had never wanted the crown. Aemond would be a warrior, scarred and dangerous, the dragon rider who had claimed Vargar and made himself the terror of the Green Cause. And Daeron, the youngest, was still in Oldtown, studying at the Citadel, waiting for his own moment to ride to war. Gwayne imagined them all, and he imagined the war they were fighting. He had heard the stories. He knew that Criston Cole had been named Hand of the King, that the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard had risen to a position that should have belonged to a man of higher birth. He knew that Cole had led the Green armies into the field, that he had marched against the Black forces with a ferocity that surprised even his allies, and Gwayne knew that he would be serving under that same man, the knight who had once unhorsed him in front of the entire court, the man who had risen from nothing to become the most powerful soldier in the Seven Kingdoms. He arrives carrying Hightower expectations, political caution, and an uncertain faith in Criston Cole. The expectations were clear enough. House Hightower had been the architects of the Green Cause, the family that had placed Alicent on the throne and Aegon upon it. They had funded the war, supplied the armies, and provided the legitimacy that the Greens needed to claim the Iron Throne. Gwayne was not just a knight riding to war, he was a Hightower, and the Hightowers did not send their sons to serve as common soldiers. He was expected to command, to advise, to represent the interests of his house in a court that was increasingly dominated by the martial ambitions of Criston Cole. The political caution was harder to carry. Gwayne had spent decades in Oldtown, Far from the intrigues of the Red Keep, he knew the Game of Thrones from a distance. But he had never played it himself. He understood that his father Otto had been removed from power once, that the Old Hand had been outmaneuvered by Rhaenyra's faction and sent back to the Reach in disgrace. He understood that the Greens were not a unified front, that there were tensions between the Hightowers and the other noble houses who had sworn to Aegon's cause. He understood that every decision he made would reflect on his family, that every failure would be used against them, that every success would be claimed by others. And then there was Criston Cole. Gwayne's faith in the man was uncertain at best. He remembered the tournament of 111, the moment when Cole had ridden against him and sent him crashing to the ground. He remembered the humiliation, the way the crowd had gasped and then applauded, the way Alicent had looked away, the way his father had said nothing but had made his disappointment clear. He remembered the years that followed, when Cole had risen from a common-born knight to the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, when he had become Alicent's most trusted ally, when he had been named Hand of the King and given command of the Green Armies. Gwayne respected Cole's skill. He respected his rise, but he did not trust him. The road to King's Landing gave Gwayne time to think about all of this. 3 months is a long time to be alone with your thoughts. The landscape changed as he rode north. The green fields of the Reach gave way to the rolling hills of the Crownlands. The air grew cooler, the sky more grey. He passed through towns that were already fortifying their walls, villages that had been abandoned, Frost, where the signs had been torn down so that no one could find their way. The war was coming, and the land was preparing itself. When he finally saw the walls of King's Landing rising in the distance, Gwayne felt something he had not expected. It was not relief. It was not fear. It was a kind of resignation, a recognition that the life he had known in Oldtown was over, that he was entering a world that would demand everything from him and give nothing back. He rode through the gates of the city and into the chaos of a capital preparing for siege. The streets were crowded with soldiers and merchants and refugees. The smell of smoke hung in the air. The Red Keep loomed above it all, a monument to the power that had torn the realm apart. Gwayne dismounted in the courtyard of the keep and looked up at the windows where his sister had once watched him ride in the tournament. He wondered if she was watching now. He wondered if she would recognize him. He wondered if he would recognize her. The Hightower expectations were waiting for him. The political caution was waiting for him, and Criston Cole was waiting for him. Standing in the shadows of the great hall, his white cloak draped over his shoulders, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword, the two men looked at each other across the stone floor, and neither of them spoke. There was no need for words. The tournament of 111 was still between them, and so was the war that was about to consume them both. The road from Oldtown to King's Landing is a long one, even for a man who has spent his life in the saddle. Gwayne Hightower had 3 months to watch the realm change around him. 3 months to pass through villages where the name of the king was spoken in whispers, where the fields lay untended because the men who should have been working them had been called to war. 3 months to feel the distance between the life he had known in the shadow of the Hightower and the life that awaited him in the Red Keep. When he finally reached the gates of the capital, he found a city that did not look like the one he remembered. The King's Landing of his childhood had been crowded, yes, and filthy, and dangerous in the way that all great cities are dangerous, but it had also been alive with the business of a kingdom at peace. Merchants had shouted their wares in the streets. Children had run through the mud. The guards at the gates had been bored, more interested in dice games than in the faces of the travellers passing through. Now the guards were anything but bored. They watched every cart, every rider, every pedestrian, with the kind of focus that comes from knowing that the enemy could be anywhere, that the enemy could look like anyone, that the enemy might already be inside the walls. Gwayne announced himself with the full weight of his name. Sir Gwayne Hightower, son of Otto Hightower, brother of Queen Alicent. He expected the guards to step aside, to bow, to welcome him home. Instead, they studied him with the same suspicion they gave every stranger. They asked for proof. They sent a runner to confirm his identity with someone inside the keep. They made him wait. That wait was the first sign that something had fundamentally shifted in the world he was entering. In the old King's Landing, a Hightower name had been enough. In this new King's Landing, no name was enough. Trust had become a currency too precious to spend on anyone who had not already proven themselves in blood. When he was finally admitted, the journey through the city, streets only deepened his unease. The markets were quieter, the faces were harder. The city watch patrolled in pairs, their hands never far from their swords. Gwayne noted the way the small folk looked at the gold cloaks, not with the casual resentment that city dwellers always feel for the men who keep order, but with something closer to fear, as if the watchmen were not protectors but occupiers. He knew, of course, that the war had changed everything. He had heard the reports in Oldtown, had listened to the ravens that flew from the capital with news of the Green Council and the coronation of Aegon II. He had known that his sister's children had seized the throne, that Rhaenyra had fled to Dragonstone, that the realm was splitting along lines that had been drawn years before the old king had even died. But knowing something in your mind is not the same as feeling it in your bones. And as Gwayne rode through the streets of his former home, he felt the truth of the war in a way that no raven's message could ever convey. The Red Keep itself was a fortress under siege, even though no army had yet appeared before its walls. The corridors were crowded with men in armour. The servants moved quickly, their eyes downcast. The air smelled of smoke and steel, and something else, something that Gwayne recognised after a moment as the scent of fear. Not the sharp, immediate fear of a man facing an enemy in battle, but the slow, grinding fear of people who know that their world is collapsing and can do nothing to stop it. He was led to his sister's chambers, and there he found the greatest change of all. Alicent had always been his sister first, and the Queen second. Even after she had married Viserys, even after she had borne him children, even after she had been crowned and anointed and seated on the Iron Throne beside her aging husband, there had always been a part of her that remained the girl Gwayne had grown up with in Oldtown, the girl who had laughed at his jokes, the girl who had cried on his shoulder when their mother died, the girl who had written him letters full of gossip and longing, letters that spoke of the life she had left behind in the Reach. That girl was gone. The woman who sat before him now was the Dowager Queen of a contested regime. She was the mother of a king who had been crowned in defiance of the rightful heir. She was the daughter of a hand who had spent decades manoeuvring for power. She was the centre of a court that had become a battlefield, and the weight of that position had carved new lines into her face, new shadows beneath her eyes. She greeted him with warmth, but it was the warmth of a woman who had learned to ration her emotions, the way she rationed everything else. She asked about Oldtown. She asked about their father. She asked about the journey. But every question felt like a test. Every answer, a piece of evidence that would be weighed and judged. Gwayne realised, with a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air, that his sister no longer trusted anyone. Not fully, not without reservation, not even him. The court that Alicent ruled was not the court of Viserys I. That court had been a place of pageantry and politics, of feasts and tournaments, of alliances forged over wine and broken over whispered words. This court was a place of war. The small council chamber had become a command tent. The throne room was empty, except for the Iron Throne itself, which seemed to loom larger and sharper than Gwayne remembered, as if the war had given it a hunger that it had never possessed before. Every conversation was about strategy. Every meeting was about supplies and troop movements and the positions of enemy armies. Every face in the Red Keep belonged to a soldier, or a spy, or a lord who had staked everything on the survival of Aegon II. There was no room for the old courtesies, The old rituals, the old games. There was only the war, and at the heart of that war was Gwayne's sister, a woman who had once been content to be a wife and a mother, now forced to be a general and a queen regent. She did not sleep. She did not eat. She did not smile. She held the realm together with nothing but will and fear and the loyalty of men who had as much to lose as she did. Gwayne had come to King's Landing, expecting to find his family. Instead, he found a battlefield. He had come to serve his sister. Instead, he found himself serving a cause that was larger than any one person, a cause that demanded everything and gave nothing in return. He had come home, only to discover that home no longer existed. The place he had left behind had been replaced by something harder, something colder, something that did not recognize him as one of its own. He was a stranger in his sister's court, and the worst part, the part that kept him awake in the unfamiliar bed of his assigned chambers, was the knowledge that he would never truly belong here again. The war had taken that from him, just as it had taken so much else. All he could do now was fight, and hope that when the fighting was over, there would be something left worth returning to. The days that followed were a blur of introductions and briefings. Gwayne met the commanders of the Green Armies, the lords who had pledged their swords to Aegon's cause, the knights who would ride and die beside him. He learned the names of the enemy commanders, the positions of their forces, the weaknesses in their defences. He studied maps and listened to reports and tried to understand the shape of a war that had already claimed more lives than anyone could count. And through it all, he watched his sister. He watched the way she held herself in council meetings, the way she spoke to the lords who came to swear their fealty, the way she looked at her children as if she were trying to memorize their faces before they were taken from her. He saw the cracks in her armor, the moments when her composure faltered, and the grief beneath it showed through. He saw the mother who had lost a daughter, the queen who had lost a kingdom, the woman who had lost herself somewhere in the wreckage of her family's ambition. He wanted to help her. He wanted to tell her that everything would be all right, that the war would end, that the realm would heal, that she would find peace again. But he knew that those words would be lies, and she would see through them the moment he spoke them. She had lived too long in the shadow of the Iron Throne to believe in happy endings. So instead, he did the only thing he could do. He took the command that was given to him. He put on the armor that had been polished and prepared for his arrival. He rode out into the city that had once been his home and began the work of turning it into a fortress. He became a soldier in a war that he had not started, fighting for a cause that he had not chosen, serving a sister who was no longer the person he remembered. The stranger in his sister's court had found his place at last. It was not the place he had imagined during those long months on the road from Oldtown. It was not the place he had dreamed of when he thought of returning to his family, but it was the only place that was left. And in a world that had been torn apart by war, any place at all was a gift. The city of King's Landing settled into the rhythm of occupation. The gates were guarded, the walls were manned, the streets were patrolled by men who answered to the Green Council and no one else. And Gwayne Hightower, the youngest son of Oldtown, the brother of the Queen, the knight who had been unhorsed by Criston Cole in a tourney so long ago that it felt like a different lifetime, walked the battlements and watched the horizon for the smoke that would signal the approach of dragons. Gwayne Hightower had not seen Sir Criston Cole in nearly 2 decades, but he remembered the fall as though it had happened the day before. The tourney of 111, the 5th anniversary of his sister Alicent's marriage to King Viserys, had been a celebration of unity and dynastic strength. Gwayne, young and proud, had ridden into the lists as one of the Queen's champions, his armour polished to a mirror shine, his horse caparisoned in the Hightower colours. He had expected cheers. He had expected victory. What he had not expected was the Dornish-born knight in the white cloak who met him in the tilt. The impact had been clean and devastating. Criston Cole's lance had caught Gwayne square in the chest, lifting him from the saddle and sending him crashing into the dirt before a crowd that gasped and then roared. The humiliation was not just in the fall itself, but in the way Cole had ridden past without a glance, already turning toward his next opponent. Gwayne had risen, brushed the dust from his surcoat, and walked from the field with his pride in tatters. He had told himself it was a single moment, a single loss, that he would have his chance again. But the years passed, and that chance never came. Cole rose. Gwayne remained in Oldtown. Now, in the War Council chambers of the Red Keep, Gwayne stood before that same night, and the world had turned upside down. Criston Cole was no longer merely a celebrated member of the Kingsguard. He was Lord Commander of that order. And more than that, he was the architect of the Green's entire military strategy. The man who had once been a common-born soldier, whose father had been a steward in the Dornish marches, now commanded the armies of the Iron Throne. And Gwayne Hightower, scion of one of the oldest houses in the realm, brother to the Queen Dowager, son of a former hand, was expected to take orders from him. The balance of power had shifted in ways that Gwayne could not have anticipated when he began his long ride from Oldtown. He had imagined arriving in King's Landing to find his family's influence intact, his father's counsel still shaping the realm. Instead, he found Otto Hightower dismissed from his position as Hand, the court fractured by suspicion, and the war effort directed by a man whose rise had begun with Gwayne's own public defeat. There was an irony in it that Gwayne was too disciplined to voice aloud, but that he felt in his chest every time Cole gave an order. The reunion between the two men was not dramatic in the way of songs or stories. There was no angry confrontation, no exchange of bitter words. They met in the map room, where Cole stood over a table covered in carved markers and parchment. His white cloak draped across his shoulders, his expression unreadable. Gwayne entered, announced by a page, and for a long moment neither man spoke. Then Cole nodded, a gesture that was neither warm nor cold, and gestured to the map. "Sir Gwayne," he said, "we have much to discuss." And that was all. No acknowledgement of the tourney, no reference to the fall. The past was not mentioned, but it hung in the air between them like smoke. Gwayne understood that this was Cole's way of asserting control. By ignoring what had happened, he was telling Gwayne that the old scores did not matter, that the hierarchy of the present was all that counted. And yet for Gwayne, the memory could not be so easily dismissed. Every time he looked at Cole, he saw the lance coming toward him. Every time he heard Cole's voice give a command, he felt the dust of the tawny ground beneath his back. The weight of their old rivalry now carried new significance. In the tourney, Gwayne had been a young knight seeking glory, and Cole had been an obstacle. Now, Gwayne was a military officer in Cole's army, bound by oath and duty to follow the Lord Commander's orders. The dynamic had shifted from competition to subordination, and Gwayne had to navigate that shift without letting his pride undermine his effectiveness. He was not a boy anymore. He was a man who had spent decades in Oldtown, training, waiting, watching. He had come to King's Landing to serve his family, not to settle old scores. But the tension remained, and it surfaced in small ways. When Cole outlined his plans for the campaign in the Riverlands, Gwayne listened, but he also watched. He noted the way Cole's hand rested on the hilt of his sword, the way his eyes moved across the map with the confidence of a man who had never known defeat. He noted the silences, the pauses, the moments when Cole seemed to be waiting for Gwayne to challenge him. And Gwayne understood that this was a test. Cole was measuring him, probing for weakness, trying to determine whether the Hightower brother would be an asset or a liability. Gwayne chose his words carefully. He asked questions that demonstrated his knowledge of the terrain, his understanding of supply lines, his familiarity with the houses of the Reach. He did not challenge Cole's authority, but he did not grovel either. He met the Lord Commander's gaze and spoke as an equal, even though he knew that in the chain of command he was not. It was a delicate balance, and Gwayne held it with the discipline of a man who had spent years learning to hide his feelings behind a mask of courtesy. Outside the War Council, the court watched. Alicent, his sister, had become a figure of quiet grief, her face drawn, her hands never still. She spoke to Gwayne in private, her voice low and urgent, telling him things she could not say in public. She warned him about Cole, not as a rival, but as a force that had grown beyond anyone's control. "He is not the man you remember," she said. "He has become something else." Gwayne did not ask what she meant. He could see it for himself. The Criston Cole, who had unhorsed him in the tourney, had been a knight of skill and ambition, but there had been a lightness to him, a sense that he was playing a game he enjoyed. The Criston Cole, who now commanded the Green's armies, was different. There was no lightness in him. His face was carved from stone, his voice flat and measured, his eyes holding a coldness that Gwayne had seen only in men who had killed and would kill again without hesitation. The war had changed him, or perhaps the war had simply revealed what had always been there, and so Gwayne found himself operating within a military world that was not of his making, commanded by a man who had once been his rival, serving a cause that demanded everything he had. The old rivalry had not disappeared, but it had been transformed. It was no longer about who could ride better or strike harder. It was about who could endure, who could adapt, who could serve without breaking. Gwayne had come to King's Landing, expecting to find his family's power intact. Instead, he found himself in the shadow of a man who had risen from nothing, and he had to decide what kind of knight he would be in that shadow. The war would not wait for him to find his footing. The armies were moving, the riverlands were burning, and Gwayne Hightower, the youngest son of Oldtown, the brother of the Queen, the man who had once been thrown from his horse before a cheering crowd, was now a soldier in the army of the man who had thrown him. The past was over. The present was all that mattered, and in that present, Criston Cole was in command. Gwayne Hightower had not come to King's Landing simply to fight a war. He had come to watch one. The distinction mattered, though it was one he could not speak aloud. When his father Otto sent him from Oldtown with a company of Hightower men, the orders were layered like the stones of the High Tower itself. On the surface, Gwayne was to offer his sword to the Green cause, to stand beside his sister Queen Alicent, and serve the reign of her son King Aegon II. That much was honourable, expected and true, but beneath that duty lay another, quieter purpose. Otto Hightower had spent decades reading the currents of power in King's Landing. He knew that wars were not won by armies alone, but by the men who commanded them, and the man commanding the Green armies was Sir Criston Cole. Criston had risen far from his origins as the son of a steward. He had been Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, the man who broke Rhaenyra Targaryen's heart, and then broke his oath to her. He had killed Lord Beesbury in the small council chamber with his bare hands, and he had crowned Aegon II with steel and fire in his voice. Otto trusted Criston's skill. He did not trust his judgment. The Lord Commander's zeal was a weapon that could cut both ways, and the Hightowers needed eyes upon him. Eyes that would not be fooled by charm or reputation. Gwayne was those eyes. It was a strange role for a man who had spent most of his life in Oldtown, far from the intrigues of the Red Keep. Gwayne had been a boy when his father took the family to court in 101 AC, but he had not stayed. While Alicent grew into a queen and Otto climbed the rungs of power, Gwayne remained in the shadow of the High Tower, learning the arts of war and the weight of his name. He knew the stories of his family's ancient lineage, the Maesters and the Septons, the lords and the merchants, who made Oldtown the beating heart of the Reach. But he did not know his sister's face as a woman grown. He did not know the children she had borne, or the grief she carried, or the fear that lived behind her eyes. When he finally rode through the gates of King's Landing, after 3 months on the road, he entered a city that was both familiar and the streets smelled of smoke and tension. The Red Keep loomed above him, a fortress of secrets, and waiting inside was a sister he barely recognized. Alicent received him in her chambers, and the reunion was not the warm embrace of childhood memory. It was a meeting of allies. She spoke of the war as though it were already a living thing, a beast that had to be fed with strategy and sacrifice. She spoke of Rhaenyra's dragons, of the lords who had declared for the Blacks, of the need for Hightower steel and Hightower gold. Gwayne listened. He nodded. He promised his sword and his loyalty, but he also watched. He watched the way her hands trembled when she mentioned Criston Cole. He watched the way her voice hardened when she spoke of her father. He watched the way she looked at him, not as a brother returned, but as a piece on a board that had finally arrived in the right square. And then there was Criston himself, the man who had unhorsed Gwayne at the tourney in 111 AC, now commanded the armies of the Green faction. That memory still stung, though Gwayne was too proud to show it. He had been young then, arrogant, eager to prove himself before the court. Criston had been the unknown Dornishman, the upstart who wore the white cloak with a hunger that bordered on desperation. The crowd had cheered when Gwayne hit the ground. He had never forgotten the sound. Now, years later, the roles had shifted. Criston was the Lord Commander, the Kingmaker, the man whose name was spoken with a mixture of fear and reverence in every camp and council chamber. Gwayne was the Hightower Knight, sent to serve under him, to follow his orders, and to report back to Otto on every move he made. It was a delicate dance. Gwayne had to be both ally and observer, a sword in Criston's hand and a whisper in his father's ear. He had to stand beside the man who had humiliated him in the lists and pretend that the past was buried. He had to smile when Criston gave commands and remember every word. He had to fight for the Green cause, knowing that his true battle was not against Rhaenyra's armies, but against the chaos that Criston's ambition could unleash. The war machine of the Greens was a thing of terrible efficiency. Criston had forged it with blood and iron, drilling the levees, securing the roads, hunting down the loyalists who dared to resist. He was relentless, and his men loved him for it. But Gwayne saw the cracks beneath the surface. He saw the way Criston's temper flared when he was questioned. He saw the way he dismissed the council of older, wiser lords. He saw the way he looked at Queen Alicent, not as a queen, but as a woman he had once served, and perhaps still resented. The zeal that made Criston a great commander also made him dangerous. He did not know when to stop. He did not know how to bend. And in a war where dragons could turn the tide in an instant, that rigidity could destroy everything the Hightowers had built. Gwayne's assignment was not to undermine Criston. It was to contain him, to be the voice of caution when the Lord Commander's blood ran hot, to remind him that the Hightowers had not spent decades building alliances just to see them burned by a single man's pride. It was a thankless task, and Gwayne knew it. He would be hated by the soldiers who worshipped Criston. He would be suspected by the courtiers who saw every Hightower as a schemer. He would be used by his father and his sister, each of whom had their own vision of what victory should look like. But he had been raised to serve his house. He had been raised to understand that duty was not a choice, but a burden, and he would carry it, even if it broke him. The first test came when Criston ordered the army to march. The destination was not yet clear, but the urgency was palpable. Rhaenyra's forces were gathering, and the Greens needed to strike before the Blacks could consolidate their strength. Criston called a council of war, and Gwayne attended, standing at the edge of the table, watching the map as the Lord Commander traced his finger along the rivers and roads. The other commanders nodded, eager to prove their loyalty. Gwayne said nothing. He studied the plan, looking for the flaws that Criston had missed. He found them. The supply lines were too long. The scouts were too few. The timing was too tight. But he did not speak. Not yet. He would wait until the moment when his words would carry the most weight. He would wait until Criston needed him, and then he would offer his counsel as a gift, not a challenge. That was the art of the Watcher, to be present without being seen, to be loyal without being blind, to serve without being consumed. Gwayne Hightower had come to King's Landing to fight a war, but he had also come to protect his family's legacy from the very man who was supposed to secure it. and as the army prepared to march, he knew that the hardest battles would not be fought on the field, but in the shadows of command. Gwayne Hightower enters the Red Keep not as a man who has been away for 2 decades, but as a prince of Oldtown arriving to claim what is his. His clothes are cut from the finest silks the Reach can produce, dyed in deep greens that catch the torchlight and hold it. He wears his hair longer than the court fashion in King's Landing, and he speaks with the kind of confidence that only comes from being born into one of the most powerful families in Westeros. But watch him closely, and you will see the cracks. When he greets the Lords of the Green Council, his words are sharp, almost cutting. He makes a remark about the quality of the wine in the capital, comparing it unfavourably to the cellars of the Hightower. He notes the dust on a lord's doublet, the worn leather of another's boots. These are not casual observations. They are declarations of superiority, spoken loudly enough for everyone to hear, but aimed specifically at those he considers beneath him. Lesser men, in his view, are not merely lesser in rank. They are lesser in taste, in breeding, in the very way they carry themselves. And yet, for all his flamboyant confidence, Gwayne is uneasy. You can see it in the way he lingers too long in doorways, scanning the room before entering, in the way his hand drifts to his sword hilt whenever a door opens too quickly. He has not seen his sister Alicent in years, not truly seen her, not as the woman she has become. The queen he finds in the Red Keep is not the girl he remembers from Oldtown. She is thinner, her eyes shadowed with grief, her voice carrying the weight of a crown she never asked for. When he embraces her, he holds her a moment too long, as if trying to remember what she felt like before the war took her. The war itself is a spectre that haunts every conversation. Gwayne speaks of battles and campaigns with the easy confidence of a man who has read about war in books, but never felt its breath on his neck. He dismisses the Black Forces as rabble, their commanders as overmatched. He boasts that the Hightower name alone will be enough to turn the tide. But when the talk turns to specifics, to supply lines and casualty reports, his voice falters. He does not know the names of the villages that have been burned. He does not know how many men have died in the skirmishes along the border. He knows only what he has been told, and what he has been told is filtered through the lens of House Hightower's pride. This is the armour he wears. Arrogance, cultivated over a lifetime of being told he is special, that his blood is older and purer than that of the men who serve him. It is not cruelty, not at its core. It is a shield. Rank and expectation have forged it, layer by layer, until the man beneath is almost invisible. Almost. Consider his relationship with Criston Cole. The Lord Commander of the Kingsguard is a man of low birth who rose through skill and ruthlessness. He is everything Gwayne was taught to disdain. And yet, Gwayne cannot look at him without remembering the tourney of 111. That day in the lists, Criston Cole unhorsed him before the entire court. The memory still burns. Gwayne tells himself it was luck, that the sun was in his eyes, that his horse was unsettled. But deep down he knows the truth. Criston Cole is a better fighter, and now in this war, Gwayne must serve under him, or at least alongside him, and the hierarchy of birth has been replaced by the hierarchy of competence. It is a bitter pill, and Gwayne swallows it with a grimace. He makes jokes about Criston's origins, about the Dornish blood that some whisper runs in his veins. He questions his tactics, his decisions, his loyalty to House Hightower. But these are the barbs of a man who feels his control slipping. He was sent to King's Landing to watch Criston, to report back to Oldtown, to ensure that the Green's military strategy does not stray from the interests of his family. But watching is not the same as commanding, and Gwayne is beginning to realise that the war will not be won by the elegance of a well-turned phrase or the weight of a family name. There is a moment, late one evening, when Gwayne stands alone on a balcony overlooking the city. The lights of King's Landing flicker below him, thousands of candles burning in windows that will soon be dark. He is thinking of Oldtown, of the quiet streets and the smell of the honey wine. He is thinking of his father, Otto, who sent him here, with instructions that felt more like warnings. He is thinking of the family he has not seen for so long, and the war that may keep him from ever seeing them again. His hand rests on the stone balustrade, and for a moment his shoulders slump. The arrogance falls away, and what remains is a man who is afraid of failing his family, afraid of dying in a war he did not start, afraid that all his fine words and fine clothes will mean nothing when the swords are drawn. Then a servant passes behind him, and Gwayne straightens. His chin lifts. His voice when he speaks is once again sharp and dismissive. He orders more wine. He complains about the cold. He is the Hightower once more, armoured in vanity, ready to face another day of pretending that he is not terrified. This is the paradox of Gwayne Hightower. He is a man who has been taught that he is better than others, and he believes it with all his heart. But that belief is fragile, held together by the expectations of his house and the weight of his name. When the war tests him, as it will, the armour may crack, and what lies beneath may surprise even him. For now he remains in the Red Keep, a peacock among crows, his feathers bright but his eyes always watching the horizon for the smoke of approaching armies. He is loyal, he is brave, and he is utterly unprepared for what is coming. But then, so is everyone else. The arrogance Gwayne wore like a second skin had served him well in the courts of Oldtown and King's Landing. Sharp words and a flamboyant confidence could keep lesser men at a distance, would make them think twice before testing the youngest son of House Hightower. But the road from the Red Keep stretched eastward, and the further it went, the less those polished defences mattered. The Green Army was on the march, and Gwayne Hightower was about to learn that the realm he had imagined from a saddle was not the realm that bled beneath his horse's hooves. The campaign began with banners, golden dragons on crimson fields, the Hightower Tower in white, the sigils of a dozen Reach Lords who had sworn for Aegon II. They unfurled in the morning light and snapped in a wind that carried the smell of dry grass and distant smoke. For the first few days, there was a kind of pageantry to it. Knights rode in formation, their armour polished, their horses groomed. The supply wagons creaked along in good order. Men sang marching songs that had been old when their grandfathers were young. Gwayne found himself near the front of the column, close to Sir Criston Cole, and he told himself this was what he had been born for, a Hightower knight, riding to war at the side of the Lord Commander. It sounded like a song, but songs do not mention the dust. It got into everything, into the eyes, the throat, the joints of armour. It coated the bread the men ate and turned the water in the barrels into a gritty slurry. By the end of the first week, the pageantry had thinned. The knights no longer rode in perfect formation. The marching songs had stopped, and the column had begun to pass through villages that were no longer villages. The first one was called something like Stonebridge, or maybe it was Milford. The name did not matter because the place itself was barely a memory. The houses were burned, their roofs collapsed inward like the ribs of a dead animal. The fields around them were blackened, the crops not harvested but trampled into the mud. A few chickens scratched in the ashes of a barn, but there were no people, not a single living soul. Gwayne reined in his horse at the edge of the village and stared. He had heard about the war, of course. He had sat in council chambers and listened to lords debate troop movements and supply lines. He had nodded when they spoke of the need to secure the riverlands, to punish those who had risen for Rhaenyra. But the words had been abstract, like moves on a Sivas board. This was not abstract. This was a child's doll, half melted, lying in the mud. This was a door hanging from a single hinge, creaking in a wind that no one would ever close again. Criston Cole rode past at him without stopping, his voice carried back over his shoulder, flat and practical. There was nothing here for us anyway. Keep moving. And so they kept moving, but the landscape did not improve. The next village was worse. Here the people had not fled. They had gathered in the square, around a well that had been poisoned with something that turned the water a sickly green. The bodies were still there, bloated in the sun. Gwayne's horse shied at the smell and he had to fight to keep the animal steady. One of the younger knights, a boy from a minor house in the Reach, vomited into the dust. No one mocked him. They all wanted to do the same. It was in that village that Gwayne first saw what the war truly meant for the people who had not chosen a side. An old woman sat on the steps of a sept that had been defaced, its seven-pointed star chipped away by hammers. She was alive, but barely. Her eyes were empty, and when a soldier offered her water, she did not seem to understand. Gwayne dismounted and walked toward her, his armor clanking with every step. He knelt, trying to meet her gaze. He asked her name. She looked through him as if he were made of glass. One of the maesters travelling with the army said the shock had broken something inside her, and it might never heal. Gwayne stood up and walked back to his horse. He did not look at the woman again, but he could not stop seeing her. The romance of banners and knightly duty began to collapse that day. It did not happen all at once. It was more like a slow erosion, each mile of ravaged countryside wearing away another layer of the story he had told himself. He had imagined himself as a protector, a sword raised in defense of his family and his king. He had imagined the small folk cheering as the Green Army passed, grateful for the order and justice that Aegon's reign would bring. But the small folk did not cheer. They hid, they fled, or they died before they could do either. By the time the army reached the banks of the Blackwater Rush, Gwayne had stopped trying to keep his armor polished. The dust had won, and so had something else, a weariness that had nothing to do with the miles. He found himself watching the other commanders, the men who had ordered the burnings and the poisonings and the executions. They did not seem troubled. They talked of strategy and logistics, of how many bushels of grain they could forage from the next valley, of which lords might still be persuaded to bend the knee. They spoke of the small folk as a resource, like horses or arrows, expendable, necessary losses in a necessary war. Gwayne said nothing. He was a Hightower. He was his father's son. He had been sent to watch, to report, to protect the interests of his house. But he found himself wondering what his father would say if he could see what those interests had bought. A burned village, a poisoned well, an old woman who had forgotten her own name. One evening, the army made camp in the ruins of a holdfast that had been abandoned for years. The walls were crumbling, and the roof of the great hall had fallen in, but it offered some shelter from the rain that had begun to fall. Gwayne sat apart from the other knights, his back against a damp stone wall, watching the flames of the campfire twist and dance. A young soldier approached him, holding out a bowl of something that was supposed to be stew. Gwayne took it, thanked him and set it aside. He was not hungry. The soldier lingered. He was barely more than a boy. With a wispy mustache he was clearly trying to grow, and eyes that were too wide for a war zone. He asked Gwayne if it was true that they would reach Harrenhal soon. Gwayne said he did not know. The boy nodded, and then, in a voice that cracked, asked if Gwayne thought they would win. Gwayne looked at the fire. He thought of the old woman on the steps of the defiled sept. He thought of the half-melted doll in the mud. He thought of his sister, Alicent, sitting in the Red Keep, weaving her own kind of strategy from silken whispers. He thought of his father, Otto, who had taught him that power was a game played by men who understood the rules. He looked at the boy and said that winning did not always mean what the songs said it meant. The boy did not understand. He nodded anyway and walked away, back toward the fire and the laughter of the other soldiers. Gwayne stayed where he was, alone in the shadows, watching the flames, and for the first time in his life, he wondered if the armor he wore was meant to protect him from the enemy, or from the truth of what he had become. The rain fell harder, the fire hissed, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the camp, a dog was barking, long and lonely, as if it were calling for someone who would never come home. I hope you're as amazed by this as I am. If you want to stay updated on more content like this, make sure to subscribe and join our community of curious minds. Trust me, what's coming next will challenge everything you thought you knew. The Green Army had marched, and the romance of banners had begun to fade. Gwayne Hightower rode with them. But he was beginning to understand that a campaign was not a tourney. There were no cheering crowds here, no silken pavilions, no wine-soaked celebrations after a clean victory. There was only the road, the mud, the silent stares of villagers who had learned to fear the glint of steel more than they trusted the sigil that bore it. And that sigil, the Hightower banner, was a strange thing to carry through lands that had never known Oldtown's wealth or safety. In the Reach, the name Hightower meant something. It meant centuries of scholarship, of faith, of the Citadel's wisdom and the Starry Sept's authority. It meant the beacon that had guided ships home for 1,000 years. But here, in the contested countryside between loyalties, the banner was just cloth, the name was just a sound, and the people who watched the column pass did not see the glory of Oldtown. They saw armed men, requisitioned grain, and the threat of fire. Gwayne learned quickly that noble loyalty was not a single thing. It shifted like the wind, depending entirely on who was watching. When the army passed through a village that had sworn for the Greens, the elders bowed and the children waved. But their eyes were hollow. They obeyed because they had to, because the alternative was worse. When the army approached a town that had sent men to Rhaenyra's cause, the gates were barred, the walls bristled with archers, and the loyalty of the Hightower name meant nothing at all. It inspired resentment, not respect. And in the deep woods, where outlaws and deserters hid, the banner could inspire terror. A flash of white and grey in the trees meant the lords had come to collect their due, and that due was often paid in blood. The family's ancient prestige, the weight of the Hightower legacy, became a burden Gwayne had to defend with more than polished words. He could not simply say, "I am a Hightower," and expect the world to bow. He had to prove it every day, with every decision. He had to show that the name meant something beyond privilege, that it carried duty and honour and the willingness to stand in the mud with common soldiers. But that was harder than he had imagined, because the men around him did not care about the history of his house. They cared about whether he could fight, whether he would share their rations, whether he would order them into a hopeless charge. And then there was Criston Cole. The man who had once unhorsed Gwayne in a tourney was now the architect of the war, and Gwayne was bound to serve under him. The tension between them was not simple. It was not the petty rivalry of two knights who had crossed swords years ago. It was something deeper, something about the nature of honour itself. Criston believed in the cause, believed in Aegon's claim, believed that the ends justified the means. Gwayne was beginning to wonder if the means could ever be justified when they left so much ruin in their wake. The army camped one night in a valley that had been burned 3 weeks earlier. The village was gone. The fields were black, and the only sound was the wind moving through charred rafters. Gwayne walked the perimeter with a torch, and he saw the faces of the men who followed him. They were not the shining knights of the songs. They were farmers and butchers and younger sons who had been promised glory and had found only hunger. They looked at him, and he saw something in their eyes that he had never seen in Oldtown. It was not respect. It was not fear. It was a kind of weary calculation, as if they were measuring whether he was worth dying for. He did not have an answer for them, not yet, but he knew that the burden of the Hightower banner was not carried in the saddle. It was carried in the choices he made when no one was watching, in the words he spoke when the torches burned low, in the line he drew between the knight he had been taught to be and the man the war was forcing him to become. And that line was about to be tested in a way he could not have foreseen, because the war was not just about armies and banners. It was about the people caught between them, the women and children who had no sigil to protect them, the villages that burned not because of strategy but because of cruelty. Gwayne was beginning to understand that the Hightower name would mean nothing if it was not defended with honour. And that honour was not a thing you could wear like a cloak. It was a thing you had to earn, again and again, in the mud and the ash and the silence of the night. The Hightower banner had meant safety in Oldtown. It had meant deference in the courts of King's Landing. But here, in the smouldering hamlets of the Riverlands, it meant something else entirely. Gwayne watched a farmer's wife clutch her children tighter as the column passed, and he understood, with a cold clarity, that his name inspired fear, not respect. The campaign was exposing him to the disorder that follows armies, even armies claiming righteousness. The Green Cause, for all its talk of rightful succession and stable succession, moved through the land like a plague of locusts, leaving behind empty granaries and bitter silences. He had been raised on songs of chivalric glory. He had trained in the yards of Oldtown, dreaming of the day he would ride to war, a knight of noble purpose, his sword a beacon of justice. But the reality was a slow, grinding horror. The army did not fight a single glorious battle each day. It fought 1,000 small, ugly ones against hunger, against weather, against the creeping rot of morale. Men deserted in the night, taking their horses and their weapons. Others fell ill from bad water and spoiled food, and the villages they passed through offered no welcome, only closed doors and hollow eyes. Gwayne began to recognize the widening distance between knightly ideals and military reality. The vows he had taken to protect the innocent, to defend the weak, to be a shield for the helpless, seemed like a cruel joke when the army's very existence caused the suffering it claimed to oppose. He saw soldiers take what they wanted from a farmer's coop, not out of malice, but out of simple, grinding need. He saw a young knight, barely older than a squire, strike an old man for refusing to give directions, and he saw Sir Criston Cole watch it all with a cold, calculating gaze, as if these were merely the costs of doing business. A deeper conflict was emerging within him, one that had no easy answer. His loyalty to his faction, to the Green Cause, to his father's schemes and his sister's crown, demanded that he hold the army together, that he enforce discipline, that he look the other way when necessary. For his loyalty to the vows that had made him a knight, the sacred oaths he had sworn before the Seven, demanded something else entirely. It demanded that he speak, that he act, that he stand between the innocent and the sword, even if that sword was carried by his own countrymen. The conflict came to a head one evening, after the army had made camp in a rain-soaked field. Gwayne had been riding rearguard, and he had seen a group of soldiers dragging a woman from her cottage. He had ridden forward, his hand on his sword, and ordered them to stop. They had laughed at first, until they saw the Hightower sigil on his shield. Then they had let her go, but their eyes held no shame, only resentment. He had reported the incident to Criston Cole, expecting the Lord Commander to act with the swift justice of a true knight, but Criston had only shrugged. "Men need release," he had said, his voice flat. "You cannot fight a war and keep them chaste as septons. If you want to win, you learn to look away." The words had struck Gwayne like a physical blow. This was the man who had unhorsed him before the court. The man who had seemed the very embodiment of knightly prowess. And now he was telling him that the code was a luxury, something to be discarded when it became inconvenient. Gwayne had walked away without another word, his hands trembling with a rage he could not fully name. He was not angry at Criston alone. He was angry at himself, for having believed the songs, for having thought that war could be clean. That night, he sat alone by a dying fire, the rain dripping through the canvas of his tent. He thought of his father, Otto, who had sent him here to watch, to report, to protect Hightower interests. He thought of his sister, Alicent, who had fought so hard to place her son on the throne, believing it was the right thing, the just thing. And he thought of the woman in the cottage, her face a blur of terror, her life reduced to a moment of casual cruelty by men who wore the same colours he did. The war was teaching him a lesson he had never wanted to learn. It was not a tale of heroes and villains. It was a story of broken men doing terrible things for reasons that grew more hollow with every mile. And the hardest part was that he could not simply walk away. He was a Hightower. His loyalty was bound to his blood, to his house, to the cause that had brought him here. But those bonds were now in direct conflict with the vows that had made him a knight. He could not serve both masters. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had held a tawny lance, that had worn a lady's favour, that had sworn to protect the innocent. They were clean, for now, but he knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones like cold iron, that the war would not let them stay that way. The disorder that followed the army was not an accident. It was the nature of the beast. And Gwayne Hightower, the arrogant son of Oldtown, the flamboyant knight of the tourney, was beginning to understand that the beast did not care about his vows. It only cared about survival. And survival, he was learning, had a very different set of rules. The previous chapter left us watching Gwayne Hightower as the Green Army marched deeper into the countryside, and with every league, the distance between knightly ideals and military reality grew wider. He had seen the disorder that follows armies, even those claiming righteousness. He had felt the weight of the Hightower banner, how it could inspire obedience or resentment, depending on who was watching. But the hardest lesson was still ahead of him, and it would not come from a battle or a council chamber. It would come from the women along the road. In the show's later development, Gwayne confronts the suffering inflicted upon village women by soldiers. This is not a distant report or a whispered rumour. He sees it with his own eyes. The army has passed through settlements where the only inhabitants left are the old, the very young, and the women who could not flee. And what the soldiers have done to those women is written in their faces, in the way they flinch at the sound of a horse, in the way they clutch their children closer when a man in armour approaches. Gwayne has been raised on stories of chivalry, on songs about knights who protect the weak, but the men he rides with have not been singing those songs. The confrontation comes when he speaks to Sir Criston Cole. Gwayne rejects the idea that armed men may behave like beasts simply because war has given them power. He argues that a knight is not a beast. A knight has taken oaths. A knight has sworn to defend the innocent, not to prey upon them. And when those oaths are broken, the knight is no longer a knight. He is something else entirely. Criston Cole, who has seen more war than Gwayne, listens without much reply. Perhaps he agrees. Perhaps he simply knows that war does not care about oaths. But for Gwayne, this is not a philosophical debate. It is a moral line that must be drawn. The moment becomes a moral turning point, revealing compassion beneath his aristocratic exterior. Up until now, Gwayne has been easy to dismiss as arrogant, flamboyant, naive. He arrived at camp with sharp remarks and a sense of entitlement, a man who had spent decades in Oldtown, far from the realities of war. But here, in the mud and the smoke, something shifts. He does not look away from the suffering. He does not make excuses for the men who caused it. He speaks up, even though speaking up puts him at odds with his own commander. This is not the behaviour of a man who cares only for his family's interests. This is the behaviour of a man who still believes that honour means something. It is worth remembering that Gwayne was sent to monitor Criston Cole to protect Hightower interests. His father Otto and the rest of the family needed eyes upon the Lord Commander, whose zeal and ambition were difficult to contain. But what Gwayne discovers is that the problem is not just one man's ambition. It is the nature of war itself. Armies consume everything in their path, including the humanity of the men who march in them. And when that humanity is gone, the women along the road pay the price. The village women Gwayne sees are not named in the histories. They are not part of any song. They are simply there, survivors of an army that claim to be fighting for a rightful king. And Gwayne, for all his flaws, refuses to pretend that their suffering is acceptable. He refuses to say that this is just what happens in war. He insists that knights are not beasts, and that power does not give anyone the right to behave like one. This moment does not change the course of the war. It does not stop the suffering, but it changes Gwayne. The arrogant young knight from Oldtown begins to understand that honour is not something you inherit. It is something you choose, again and again, especially when it is easier to look away. And as the campaign continues, he will carry that understanding with him. Even as the road grows darker, and the choice is harder. And it is in the days that follow that Gwayne finds himself walking a path he never expected. He begins to visit the villages himself, not as a commander, not as a Hightower, but as a man who needs to see with his own eyes what his army has left behind. He speaks to the women, though they do not trust him. Why would they? He wears the same colours as the men who took everything from them. He carries the same sword, rides the same horse, but he listens. He hears their stories, their losses, their quiet fury, and he does not offer empty promises. He does not say that justice will be done, because he knows it likely will not. Instead, he gives them what little he can. Food from his own rations, a coin or two, a word of apology that feels hollow even as he speaks it. One woman, her face bruised and her eyes empty, tells him that her husband was conscripted into the army and died in a skirmish 2 weeks ago. She did not even receive the news from a herald. She learned it from a neighbour who saw his body left by the road. Gwayne stands there, unable to find the words that might comfort her. He realises that all the songs he learned as a boy, all the tales of knights and maidens and noble sacrifice, have nothing to say about this. There is no verse for a widow in a burned-out cottage, no chorus for the children who no longer have a father. The weight of that silence presses down on him. Later, he confronts Criston Cole again, this time in private. The Lord Commander is sharpening his sword, his face unreadable. Gwayne does not shout. He does not accuse. He simply asks, "How do you live with it?" Cole looks up, and for a moment, something flickers in his eyes. Perhaps it is memory, perhaps it is regret. But he only says, "You learn to carry it, or it carries you." Gwayne does not find that answer satisfying. He wonders if Cole has ever truly carried anything at all, or if he has simply learned to let the weight fall away. But he does not press further. He knows that some questions have no answers, only consequences. As the army marches on, Gwayne begins to write letters home, not to his father, not to his sister the Queen, but to a maester he once knew in Oldtown, a man who taught him that history is written by the victors, but that truth belongs to those who remember. He writes about the villages, the women, the children. He writes about the soldiers who laugh while they loot, and the officers who look away. He writes about the smell of smoke and the sound of weeping. He does not know if the letters will ever reach their destination, but he writes them anyway, as a way of bearing witness. He is not a poet. He is not a chronicler. He is just a knight who is learning that the hardest battles are not fought with steel. And in the quiet moments, when the camp is asleep and the fires burn low, Gwayne thinks about his sister Alicent. He thinks about the life she chose, the sacrifices she made, the children she raised in a court that devours the weak. He wonders if she ever felt this same sickness, this same certainty that the world is broken in ways that cannot be mended. He wonders if she looked at her own husband, the king, and saw a man who had forgotten what honour meant. He does not have answers. He only has questions, and the road ahead, and the knowledge that he will never be the same man who rode out of Oldtown with a banner and a song. The women along the road had been the first crack, the first moment when the distance between Gwayne Hightower's training and the reality of this war became too wide to ignore. He had seen their faces, the hollow silence of those who had been used by men wearing the same colours he wore. He had heard the laughter of soldiers who did not understand why a knight would care, and he had said nothing at first. But silence for a man like Gwayne was never a permanent state. It was the pause before the storm, the breath before the blade was drawn, and the storm was about to break over Sir Criston Cole. The army had made camp in the shadow of a burned-out holdfast, its walls blackened and its gates hanging crooked on their hinges. The men were restless, tired of marching, tired of waiting for a battle that seemed always just beyond the next ridge. Fires burned low, and the smell of wood smoke mixed with the sour tang of sweat and leather. Gwayne walked through the camp with a purpose that drew eyes. His white cloak catching the firelight, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. He was not looking for a fight. He was looking for an answer, and he knew exactly where to find the man who owed him one. Criston Cole sat apart from the other commanders, his back against a fallen stone, his armor dull with travel dust. He did not rise when Gwayne approached. He did not even look up. He simply waited, the way a man waits for a messenger he already knows will bring bad news. Gwayne stopped a few paces away, close enough that the men nearby could hear, far enough that this was not a private conversation. He wanted witnesses. He wanted the words to carry. You gave them permission, Gwayne said. His voice was steady, but there was heat beneath it, the kind of heat that comes from a fire long banked and suddenly fed. You told the men that the villages were enemy ground, that the women were spoils, that a soldier's need was a soldier's right. I heard you say it. I was there. Criston finally raised his head. His eyes were flat, unreadable, the eyes of a man who had learned long ago that emotion was a weakness he could not afford. The army needs to move fast, Cole said. It needs to be feared. A clean campaign is a slow campaign. You want to win a war, or you want to hold hands with peasants. I want to be a knight, Gwayne said. The word hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them had expected. I want to remember what that means, and I want you to remember that you took the same vows I did. You swore to protect the innocent. You swore to defend the weak. You stood in a sept and spoke those words before the crone and the mother, and I do not believe you have the right to set them aside, because the road is long and the men are bored. Criston stood slowly, deliberately, the way a man stands when he is about to end a conversation by force. The old humiliation, the tourney at King's Landing, the moment when Cole had unhorsed Gwayne in front of the entire court. That was supposed to be the wound that defined them. The arrogant young Hightower, thrown from his saddle, eating dirt, while the crowd cheered for the Dornish upstart. But Gwayne had carried that memory for years, and he had learned something from it. He had learned that humiliation was a teacher, not a chain. He had learned that the man who humiliates you today may be the man you must stand beside tomorrow. And he had learned that the true test of a knight is not how he falls, but how he rises after. This is not about the tourney, Gwayne said, and he saw the flicker of surprise in Criston's eyes. This is about the women. This is about the children. This is about the oath we both swore, and the oath you are breaking every time you look the other way. You can call me a fool. You can call me naive. You can remind me that I have never commanded an army, that I have never starved in the field, that I have never watched my men die for a cause that seemed to shrink with every mile. But you cannot call me a liar, and you cannot call me a coward. Not tonight. The camp had gone quiet. Men who had been sharpening blades or mending boots had stopped to watch. The firelight painted their faces in orange and shadow, and Gwayne saw something in their expressions that he had not expected. He saw doubt. He saw the same unease he had felt when he first saw the women along the road, the same question that had been gnawing at the edges of their loyalty. If the commander could break his oath, what else could he break? Criston stepped closer, close enough that Gwayne could smell the wine on his breath, the dust on his cloak. You think honor wins battles, Cole said, his voice low and hard. You think the small folk care about your pretty words when their homes are ash and their children are dead. They care about strength. They care about fear. They care about the man who can take what he wants and leave nothing behind but silence. That is how you win a war. That is how you keep your king on the throne. Then we have already lost, Gwayne said. Not the war. The war is still being fought, and it may be won or lost 100 times before the final blow is struck. But the thing that makes us different from the men we fight, the thing that makes us knights instead of butchers, that is already gone if you believe what you just said. And I will not follow a man who has abandoned that. I will not serve a commander who has forgotten the first duty of a knight. He turned and walked away, not because he was afraid, but because he had said everything that needed to be said. The silence followed him through the camp, past the fires and the tents and the faces of men who would remember this night. Some of them would side with Cole. Some of them would think Gwayne a fool, a pampered son of Oldtown who who had never known real hardship, but some of them would remember. Some of them would carry the memory of a knight who stood up to his commander and spoke the words they were too afraid to say. The conflict between Gwayne and Criston was never really about the tournament. It was never about the old humiliation. The moment when a young Hightower was thrown from his horse and the crowd laughed, that was just the surface, the scar that everyone could see. Beneath it, there was something deeper, something that had been growing for years. It was a clash of principles, a war within the war. Criston Cole believed that victory justified any means, that the end was all that mattered, that the oaths of knighthood were words written for a world that no longer existed. Gwayne believed that the oaths were the only thing that made the war worth fighting. Without them, the army was just a mob with swords. Without them, the green cause was just another excuse for blood. And in that moment, standing in the firelight, Gwayne Hightower revealed his growth. He risked everything: his position, his safety, his relationship with the most powerful commander in the army, to defend an idea. Not a castle, not a title, not a strategic advantage. An idea. The idea that a knight is not a beast. The idea that restraint is not weakness. The idea that honor is not a luxury for peacetime, but the only thing that makes war bearable. He walked back to his tent, and the camp settled into its uneasy quiet. The fires burned low, and the stars wheeled overhead, and somewhere in the darkness, a woman wept. Gwayne heard her, and he did not look away. He sat down on his bedroll and stared at the canvas wall, and he thought about the road ahead. There would be more battles, there would be more choices, and every time he would have to decide whether to speak or to stay silent. Tonight, he had spoken. Tomorrow, he would have to live with the consequences. But as the night deepened and the camp fell into a restless sleep, Gwayne found himself thinking not of Criston Cole, not of the war, not of the king or the queen or the throne. He thought of the women along the road. He thought of their faces, their silence, their eyes that had seen too much. And he thought of the oath he had sworn, the words that bound him to something greater than himself. He had kept that oath tonight. He would keep it again, and if that meant standing alone against the entire army, then he would stand alone, because that was what knights did. That was what the words meant, and that was the only truth that mattered when the fires burned low and the night stretched on without end. The confrontation with Criston Cole was not a rebellion. It was not a break. Gwayne Hightower stood his ground, spoke the words that needed speaking, and then he did not walk away from the army. He did not abandon his post. He did not renounce his family or his king. He remained. And that is the harder truth to sit with, because a moral awakening that does not sever a person from their cause does not make them free. It makes them a prisoner who can see the bars. Gwayne remains loyal to Alicent, to Otto, to the green cause that put Aegon II on the Iron Throne. He has not become a black. He has not become a deserter. He has not even become a reformer in any meaningful political sense. What he has become is a man who now sees the cost of his loyalty with his eyes, and that changes everything and nothing at the same time. He will still ride when commanded. He will still fight when the banners go up, but he will do so knowing that the army he serves is capable of cruelty, that the commander he answers to is willing to look away, and that the cause he was born into is not as clean as the songs in Oldtown promised. This is the trap that the Dance of the Dragons sets for decent people. It does not ask them to be villains. It asks them to be loyal, and loyalty, when it is demanded without question, becomes a cage. Gwayne cannot simply choose to stop being a Hightower. He cannot erase the blood that runs through him, or the decades of expectation that shaped him. His father Otto built the Green faction with careful, patient ambition. His sister Alicent spent years positioning her children for a throne that was never meant to be theirs by right, but by will. Gwayne is part of that architecture. He is a stone in that wall, and stones do not get to decide which wall they belong to. What makes his position so painful is that he is now aware of the cracks. He has seen the army mistreat women along the road. He has challenged Cole and been met with cold pragmatism, dressed up as command. He has heard the arguments for why knights must behave as beasts in wartime, and he has rejected them. But rejection is not the same as escape. He still wears the Hightower sigil. He still carries a sword for the Greens. He still answers to men who do not share his scruples. And so Gwayne exists in a kind of moral twilight. He is not ignorant enough to be comfortable, and he is not brave enough to be free. That is not a judgment on his courage. It is an observation about how the dance consumes people. To break entirely from your family in the middle of a civil war is not just a personal choice. It is a death sentence. It is exile. It is the loss of every relationship, every connection, every piece of identity you have ever known. Gwayne would have to abandon his sister, his father, his king, his house, and his entire history. And he would have to do it knowing that the other side might not trust him either. A man who betrays his own blood is useful, but he is never fully accepted. So Gwayne stays. And staying means he must find a way to live with the contradictions. He must continue to serve a cause that he now knows is flawed. He must continue to follow a commander he has openly challenged. He must continue to carry a banner that represents something he no longer believes in completely. And he must do all of this without losing himself entirely. This is the quiet tragedy of the Green faction. It is not a faction of monsters. It is a faction of people who have convinced themselves that their cause is just, and who are willing to overlook the costs because the alternative is too terrible to consider. Otto Hightower believes he is securing the realm. Alicent believes she is protecting her children. Criston Cole believes he is upholding the honour of the Kingsguard, even as he allows dishonourable acts to happen under his command. And Gwayne believes in the ideals of knighthood, even as he serves an army that betrays those ideals every day. The dance does not allow for clean hands. It does not allow for moral purity. It forces everyone to choose, and then it forces them to live with the consequences of that choice. Gwayne chose his family. He chose the Greens. And now he must watch what that choice demands of him. There is a particular kind of pain in serving a cause you no longer fully trust. It is not the pain of the martyr who dies for something they believe in completely. It is the pain of the functionary who keeps the machine running even after they have seen what the machine produces. Gwayne is not a hero. He is not a villain. He is a man who woke up inside a war he did not start, and who is now trying to hold on to his honor with both hands while the current drags him downstream, and the current is strong. Because the Green Army does not stop moving just because one knight has doubts. The campaign continues. The villages burn, the women suffer, and Gwayne rides with them. Because that is what loyalty means. It means showing up even when you know better. It means doing your duty even when your conscience screams. It means staying in the formation even when you can see the formation is flawed. This is the limit of Green loyalty. It is not that Gwayne is incapable of moral growth. He has proven that he is. It is that moral growth, in the context of civil war, does not automatically translate into action. It translates into suffering. He sees more clearly now, and that clarity is a burden. It makes every order harder to follow. It makes every battle harder to fight. It makes every silence harder to keep. But he keeps them because he is a Hightower, because he is a knight, because he swore oaths that he cannot unsay, and because, somewhere beneath that, the doubt and the disillusionment, he still loves his sister. He still respects his father. Even if he no longer agrees with him, he still believes that the Greens have a claim. Even if he no longer believes that claim justifies everything done in its name. That is the trap. That is the tragedy. Gwayne Hightower is too good to be a monster, and too loyal to be a rebel, and so he is caught in the middle, riding with an army he cannot fully endorse, toward a future he cannot fully see, carrying a conscience that grows heavier with every mile. The war will not wait for him to resolve his doubts. It will not pause while he decides what he believes. It will keep moving, and he will keep moving with it, because that is what soldiers do. And somewhere along that road, Between the burned villages and the silent women and the cold stares of his commander, Gwayne will have to decide whether his loyalty is a virtue or a chain, whether he is holding on to his family or whether his family is holding on to him, whether the man who stays is braver than the man who walks away, or whether he is just more afraid. Those are questions that the dance does not answer easily, and for Gwayne Hightower, they may not have an answer at all. Only the road ahead, and the weight of the name he carries, and the quiet, growing knowledge that some cages are built of blood and duty, and that the door only opens from the inside. And yet, for all the moral weight Gwayne carries in the later campaigns, the account preserved him places him in a very different but equally fitting role, not as a field commander marching through the Riverlands, but as a Hightower man stationed at the capital's vulnerable heart. This is the Gwayne Hightower of the books, the one who serves not under Criston Cole's banner, but within the gold cloaks of the City Watch. In the written history, Gwayne's story begins long before the war itself. He comes to King's Landing in 101 AC, when his father Otto is named Hand of the King by old King Jaehaerys I. He grows up in the Red Keep, a young knight of House Hightower, watching the court shift and fracture around him. But unlike the show's portrayal, where he arrives from Oldtown as a stranger to his own family's politics, the book version of Gwayne is already embedded in the capital's power structure. He knows the streets, the gates, the loyalties of the men who wear the gold cloaks, and when the Dance of the Dragons begins in 129 AC, his father Otto names him second in command of the City Watch. The appointment is strategic. Otto needs eyes inside the Watch, someone he can trust to monitor the commander, Luther Largent. Largent is a capable man, but his loyalty to King Aegon II is uncertain. Otto suspects that Large may still hold allegiance to Prince Daemon Targaryen, who once commanded the Gold Cloaks himself, so he places his own son in the chain of command, ordering Gwayne to watch the commander for any sign of disloyalty. This is a delicate position for Gwayne. He is not simply a figurehead, a Hightower name propped up in the barracks. He is an active officer, expected to walk among the watchmen, to know their faces and their whispers. The Gold Cloaks are not a unified force. Many of them remember Daemon's tenure with fondness. Some have personal ties to the men who now serve the Blacks, and Gwayne, for all his arrogance, understands that he is walking into a nest of potential betrayal. The book tells us that Gwayne performs his duty with the same rigid sense of honour that defines his later confrontation with Cole in the show. He watches Largent, but he does not act rashly. He waits for evidence, for a misstep, for the commander to reveal his true colours. But Largent is patient. He plays the loyalist, obeying orders from the Green Council while keeping his own counsel. And Gwayne, bound by his father's command, can only observe and report. The tension comes to a head in 130 AC, when Queen Rhaenyra's forces attack King's Landing. The city falls faster than anyone expects. Gwayne, hearing the alarm, rushes to the stables. He intends to sound the warning, to rally the watch, to do something. But before he can mount a horse, he is seized, disarmed, dragged before Luther Largent, who has finally shown his hand. Largent remains loyal to Prince Daemon. He has been waiting for this moment, perhaps for years. And Gwayne, the Hightower spy placed to watch him, is now the prisoner. The commander who was supposed to be monitored has turned the tables. Gwayne is captured, and the Gold Cloaks slip entirely from Green control. This is Gwayne's death in the books. He is killed during the sack of the city, a casualty of the very watch he was meant to command. It is a quiet end for a man who in the show grows into a morally complex warrior, but in his role is smaller, more contained. He is a piece on the board, placed by his father to guard a critical position, and removed when the board shifts. Yet even in this reduced role, the core of Gwayne Hightower remains. He is loyal, he is dutiful, he is willing to stand at the capital's vulnerable heart, knowing that the men around him may not share his allegiance. The Gold Cloaks of the book do not offer him the same moral awakening as the Riverlands campaign in the show. but they do reveal something essential about his character. He is not a man who runs from danger. He is a man who stays at his post, even when that post becomes a trap. And that loyalty, that stubborn adherence to duty, is what defines him across both versions of the story. Whether he is challenging Criston Cole over the treatment of village women, or watching Luther Largent for a betrayal that never comes, Gwayne Hightower is a man who believes in the oaths he has sworn. The tragedy is that those oaths lead him to a death he cannot escape. The gold cloaks of the book, then, offer a different perspective on the same truth. Gwayne is not a hero of epic battles or grand speeches. He is a knight who serves where he is placed, who watches and waits, and who falls when the city falls. And in that fall, he becomes one of the many casualties of a war that consumed not just dragons, but the men who tried to hold the realm together with nothing more than loyalty and a gold cloak. The previous chapter left us with Gwayne Hightower standing in the shadow of the Red Keep, newly appointed as second in command of the City Watch. His father, Otto Hightower, had given him a task that was simple in its wording, but treacherous in its implication. Watch Commander Luther Largent. Watch him for signs of disloyalty. And in that single command, Otto placed his son squarely between the authority of the crown and the uncertain loyalty of the gold cloaks. The book version of Gwayne lives amid a city where allegiances can change behind closed gates. King's Landing in 129 AC is not the gleaming capital of the early years of Viserys' reign. It is a city of whispers and shifting shadows, where a man's loyalty is measured not by his oath, but by the company he keeps after dark. The gold cloaks are the backbone of the crown's power in the streets, but they are also a force that can turn against that crown if the right hand guides them. Otto knew this. He had served as hand long enough to understand that the City Watch was not merely a police force, but a political weapon, and he had seen what happened when that weapon fell into the wrong hands. So he gave his son a charge that was both an honour and a burden. Gwayne would be the eyes and ears of the Hightowers within the Watch. He would walk the same patrols as the common men, wear the same golden cloak, and listen for the same dangerous rumours. But his true purpose was to watch the man who commanded them all, Luther Largent. The name itself carried weight in the barracks and the brothels alike. He was a veteran of the Stepstones, a man who had fought beside Prince Daemon Targaryen when the prince was still the commander of the City Watch. That was years ago, of course. Daemon had been exiled, disgraced, and then reconciled with the crown more times than most men could count. But the bond between a commander and his men does not always break when the commander leaves. It lingers, it festers, and in the case of Luther Largent, it remained a quiet devotion that never fully died. Gwayne studied Largent from the moment he took his post. He watched the way the commander spoke to the men, the way he issued orders, the way he handled the daily reports of crime and unrest. On the surface, everything was proper. Largent performed his duties with the efficiency of a man who had worn the golden cloak for decades. He answered to the crown. He enforced the king's law. He gave no obvious reason for suspicion. But Otto had not sent his son to look for obvious reasons. He had sent him to look for the subtle ones, the glances that lingered too long, the conversations that stopped when Gwayne entered the room, the men who seemed to follow Largent with a devotion that went beyond duty. And Gwayne found them, not in the open but in the margins. A captain here, a sergeant there, men who had served under Daemon during his years as commander, and who still spoke of him with a reverence that bordered on worship. They did not speak of the prince as a disgraced exile. They spoke of him as the rightful lord of the city, the man who had made the Watch feared and respected. They remembered the gold cloaks that Daemon had given them, not as a uniform, but as a badge of personal loyalty. The tension built slowly, like the pressure before a storm. Gwayne reported his observations to his father in careful, measured language. He did not accuse. He did not demand action. He simply noted that certain men within the Watch seemed to hold Prince Daemon in high regard, and he noted that Commander Largent did nothing to discourage them. Otto listened, he nodded, and he told his son to continue watching. The days passed. The war raged beyond the city walls, but inside King's Landing, the real battle was fought in silence. Gwayne walked the streets in his golden cloak, a Hightower in disguise, a spy among the men who were supposed to be the crown's most loyal servants. He saw the way the common folk looked at the Watch, not with trust but with fear. He saw the way the men themselves carried their authority, sometimes with restraint, sometimes with cruelty, and he saw the way Luther Largent moved through it all, a calm centre in a city of chaos. But the calm was a mask. Gwayne knew it, Otto knew it, and somewhere beyond the city, Prince Daemon knew it too. The question was not whether Largent remained loyal to Daemon. The question was when that loyalty would be called upon. And when it was, Gwayne would be caught in the middle, a Hightower standing between the authority of the crown and the devotion of men who had never truly given their hearts to any king but the rogue prince. The streets of King's Landing grew darker with each passing week. The war consumed more and more of the realm, and the capital became a place of hunger and suspicion. Gwayne continued his watch, but he knew that the game was changing. The gold cloaks were not just a force to be monitored, they were a force that could decide the fate of the city. And Luther Largent, for all his apparent service, was the key to that force. In the quiet moments between patrols, Gwayne thought about his father's command. He thought about the weight of the golden cloak on his shoulders, and he thought about the men who served beside him. Men whose true allegiance was hidden behind closed gates, waiting for the moment when the city would fall, and their prince would return. The previous chapter left us inside the uneasy quiet of King's Landing, where Gwayne Hightower, second in command of the City Watch, lived under the shadow of his father's command. Otto had ordered him to watch Commander Luther Largent, to test the man's loyalty to King Aegon II, but suspicion alone could not hold the city together. By the year 130 after the conquest, the war had already bled across the realm, and now it was coming home. It happened on a night that would be remembered as the moment the city turned. Rhaenyra's forces descended upon King's Landing, not with a siege army at the gates, but with something far more insidious. The defences of the capital had been built to repel an external enemy, but the true danger had been growing inside the walls for months. Gold cloaks, who had once sworn to protect the crown, now whispered among themselves, their loyalties shifting like shadows in the torchlight. The city's protectors were divided, and the danger came from within as much as without. Gwayne had felt the tension building. He had watched Luther Largent move through the barracks with an ease that seemed too deliberate, too practiced. The commander smiled at the right men, spoke the right words, and never once betrayed his true allegiance. But Gwayne had been trained to read men, and he knew that Largent's loyalty belonged not to the Greens, but to Prince Daemon Targaryen. The prince had a way of collecting allies in the most unexpected places, and the City Watch had become his hunting ground. When the first reports came in that Rhaenyra's forces had breached the outer gates, Gwayne did not hesitate. He rushed toward the stables, his boots pounding against the cobblestones as the city erupted around him. The alarm had to be raised. If the gold cloaks could be rallied, if the king's men could be organised before the enemy flooded the streets, there might still be a chance to hold the Red Keep. But as he ran, he saw the truth written in the faces of the men he passed. Some looked confused, some looked afraid, and some looked relieved. The stables were chaos. Horses screamed and stamped in their stalls as guardsmen scrambled for weapons that were not there. Gwayne grabbed the reins of the nearest mount, but before he could swing into the saddle, hands seized him from behind. Strong arms pinned his arms to his sides. A blade pressed against his throat. He was disarmed in an instant, his sword clattering to the ground as the men who had once followed his orders now dragged him forward. They brought him before Luther Largent. The commander stood in the centre of the yard, his face calm, his hands steady. He did not gloat. He did not threaten. He simply looked at Gwayne with something that might have been pity, and then gave the order to secure him. The city had fallen not to a single charge, a siege tower, but to a quiet betrayal that had been years in the making. The gold cloaks, the very men meant to defend the capital, had opened the gates from within. Gwayne was taken to a cell beneath the Red Keep, where the sounds of the invasion filtered down through the stone. He could hear the clash of steel, the shouts of men, the distant roar of dragons overhead, but he could do nothing. He had been loyal to his father, to his sister, to the crown, and yet loyalty had not been enough. The city had turned, and he had turned with it, not by choice, but by the force of a betrayal he could not have prevented. In the days that followed, the full scope of the disaster became clear. Rhaenyra had taken the city without a prolonged siege. The Red Keep had fallen, the king had fled, and Gwayne Hightower, the second in command of the City Watch, sat in a cell and waited for whatever fate his captors had in store. The war was far from over, but for him, the battle for King's Landing had already been lost. The night the city turned was not a night of heroics or last stands. It was a night of quiet treachery, of men choosing sides in the dark, of a commander who had played the long game and won. Gwayne had done what he could. He had run for the stables. He had tried to raise the alarm. But in the end, the city's defences had unravelled from within, and the danger that had been growing beneath the surface had finally broken through. The alarm never reaches the horn. Gwayne Hightower's boots pound against the stone as he sprints toward the stables, the distant clash of steel already echoing from the river gate. The city is waking to chaos. He knows the gold cloaks should be forming ranks, that the gates must be held, that every second matters. But the stables are not empty when he arrives. Men in dark cloaks move through the torchlight with purpose, and before Gwayne can shout a command, Anne sees him from behind. His sword is wrenched from his grip. His arms are pinned. He struggles, but there are too many, and they know exactly who he is. They drag him through the streets of King's Landing, past the shadows of buildings he has patrolled for months, past the faces of men he once commanded. The city is not falling to an outside army alone. It is turning from within, and the man who now stands before him, flanked by gold cloaks who do not salute, is Luther Largent, commander of the City Watch. The man Gwayne's own father ordered him to watch for disloyalty. The book account, preserved in fire and blood, records this moment without embellishment. Gwayne is brought before Largent, disarmed and helpless, while the sounds of the invasion grow louder beyond the walls. There is no dramatic confrontation, no exchange of bitter words that the chroniclers saw fit to preserve. What remains is the cold fact of capture. Luther Largent, whom Otto Hightower had suspected of secret allegiance to Prince Daemon, reveals that allegiance in the only way that matters. He does not free Gwayne. He does not listen to any plea. The second in command of the City Watch is taken prisoner by his own commander, and the gates of King's Landing open to Rhaenyra's forces soon after. This is the end that the books give to Gwayne Hightower. He dies in the sack of King's Landing in the year 130, a casualty of the war that his own family helped to ignite. The exact manner of his death is not described in detail, only that he perishes during the fall of the city. Is a quiet end for a man who lived in the shadow of greater names, a footnote in a conflict that consumed dragons and kings. But the show has not yet reached this point. The screen version of Gwayne Hightower remains alive, his future unwritten, his fate still hanging in the balance of seasons yet to come. That uncertainty preserves something precious for viewers. It keeps the door open. It allows the character to grow beyond the boundaries of the historical record, to become something more than a name on a page. And in that space between the book and the screen, Gwayne becomes a portrait of something larger. He is a Hightower, born into one of the oldest and most powerful families in the Reach, raised in the shadow of the Citadel and the Starry Sept. The volatility of his house runs through him. He is proud, quick to speak, slow to doubt his own convictions. He arrives at King's Landing, with the arrogance of a man who has never known real defeat, only the temporary humiliation of being unhorsed in a tourney by Sir Criston Cole. That arrogance carries him through the early days of the war, through the councils and the campaigns, through the long ride from Oldtown to the capital. But the war does not leave him unchanged. The show gives us a Gwayne who confronts the reality of what his side has become. In Season 3, he challenges Criston Cole over the treatment of village women, arguing that knights are not beasts, that their oaths mean something. It is a moment of moral awakening, a shift from naive loyalty to uncomfortable awareness. He begins to see the cost of the war, not as a distant abstraction, but as something that happens to real people, to women and children who never chose this conflict. He does not abandon his allegiance. He does not switch sides. He remains loyal to Alicent, to Otto, to the Green cause. But that loyalty becomes heavier, more painful, more complicated. He is no longer the arrogant young knight who came to court seeking glory. He is a man who has seen what glory actually costs. The book version of Gwayne never gets that arc. He is an officer of the City Watch, appointed second in command by his father in 129, ordered to watch Luther Largent for signs of betrayal. He lives in a city where allegiances shift behind closed gates, where the loyalty of the gold cloaks is never certain, where every shadow could hide an enemy. When the invasion comes, he acts on instinct. He runs to raise the alarm. He does not hesitate. But instinct is not enough against a conspiracy that has been months in the making. He is seized, disarmed, and brought before the very man he was supposed to be watching. And that is where his story ends. There is a kind of tragedy in that ending that the show has the chance to deepen or to alter. The historical Gwayne dies without ever knowing whether his father's suspicions were correct, without ever proving himself in battle, without ever growing beyond the role he was given. The screen Gwayne has already surpassed that fate. He has spoken out against injustice. He has questioned his own commander. He has begun to understand that honor is not the same as loyalty, and that the two can pull a man in opposite directions until he tears apart. What remains in both versions is a portrait of Hightower volatility. The family is old, proud, and deeply connected to the institutions that shape Westerosi society. They are the custodians of the Citadel, the patrons of the Maesters, the keepers of the Starry Sept. They are not a house that bends easily. And Gwayne embodies that stubborn pride, that refusal to see himself as anything less than what his name demands. But he also embodies the cost of that pride. He is imperfect. He makes mistakes. He trusts the wrong people, or he trusts the right people too late. He is loyal to a cause that asks him to sacrifice everything, including his own moral compass. And in the end, whether in the pages of fire and blood, or in the unfolding episodes of the show, he is awakened to the cost of war. The book Gwayne learns that lesson in his final moments as he is dragged before Luther Largent and the gates fall. The screen Gwayne learns it earlier, in a camp where women are treated as spoils and knights forget their oaths, but both of them arrive at the same truth. War does not care about your name. It does not care about your pride. It takes what it wants, and it leaves behind only the broken pieces of what you once were. So Gwayne Hightower stands at the edge of two different fates, one written and one still unwritten. The book has given us his end. The show has given us his beginning. And in between, there is a space where his story can still breathe, where the volatility of his house can become something more than a footnote. He is proud, he is loyal, he is imperfect, and he is finally awake to the price of the war his family helped to start. That is the hidden truth of Gwayne Hightower, not a hero, not a villain, just a man who ran toward the stables to sound the alarm, and found that the city had already turned against him.